Chapter 332. Lucian, who was wearing a full set of silver armor, walked into Swan Castle with heavy footsteps. A squire took over Lucian's helmet and sword, and a pretty maid bowed to Lucian and presented him with a clean wet towel. Lucian wiped his face with the towel and asked, "Where is the lady?" The maid took over the wet towel and answered softly, "The count is changing his clothes on the second floor." Lucian nodded and walked up the spiral stairs to the second floor. He pushed open a wooden door and saw that Countess Schultz had already changed into a pure black dress. Her beautiful hair was coiled into the most popular upper-class bun style, and a string of sparkling and translucent pearl necklaces hung around her creamy neck. Her delicate and three-dimensional facial features were lightly painted, making her look graceful and luxurious, and her beauty was unparalleled. "You're back." Countess Schultz smiled at her husband and helped him take off his armor. She asked, "What did you get today?" Lucian smiled and shrugged. "What can I find? I just accompanied Viscount Angley to walk around Swan Castle. However, I found that the Viscount's was not perfunctory. He was looking for the bishop's whereabouts very seriously." Countess Schultz smiled faintly and said disapprovingly, "He's looking for a needle in a haystack. What can he find?" Lucian frowned and said, "I think he might have found something. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so focused all the time, as if he was really looking for clues." Countess Schultz's hands paused for a second, and her face became a bit serious. "Did he find something?" Lucian shook his head. "I don't know. However, since he didn't want Vera to come to Swan City to meet you, he must have some suspicions." Count Schultz frowned and said in confusion, "I can't figure out what went wrong that made him suspicious." Lucian said his guess while taking off his armor. "Maybe he already knows the identity of Vera's real mother?" "I don't think so." Count Schultz shook his head. "Since that person is so sure that Marquis Garcia would not stand up to refute me, it means that the identity of Vera's biological mother is extremely sensitive. It is unlikely that Viscount Angley would know about this secret." Lucian could not help but ask curiously, "Did that person say anything about Vera's real mother?" "No. He only said that Vera's real biological mother did not dare to acknowledge Vera at all." Lucian rubbed his chin, as if he was trying to figure out who Vera's real mother was. Seeing this, Count Schultz reminded him, "All right, stop guessing. If you're worried that Viscount Angley has discovered something, you can test him during the banquet later." Lucian nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go wash up and change into clean clothes." Dong dong dong. At this moment, there was a sudden knock on the door. "Come in," Count Schultz said loudly, and then the butler pushed the door open and walked in. The butler first greeted the Count and his wife, and then reported, "My lord, Viscount Angley wants to visit Swan Castle." "Visit? I think he wants to search the castle," Lucian said with a cold face. Count Schultz's eyes also narrowed, but she soon returned to normal. She said to the butler, "Please ask Viscount Angley to wait for a while. I'll accompany him to visit Swan Castle." "Yes, my lady," the butler replied and closed the door again. Lucian's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and he said coldly, "Did he really find something?" Count Schultz patted her husband's strong chest and comforted him. "If he really found something, he should pretend that he knows nothing, and then quietly leave Swan Castle to ask for help from Winter. He shouldn't have alerted us like this." Lucian nodded and felt that his wife was right. Then he restrained his aura. "Then what are you going to do? If he wants to visit, then I'll accompany him." Count Schultz said indifferently. Lucian understood his wife's meaning. He nodded and said, "Okay, you go accompany him. I'll go ask that guy to move his nest." "Okay." Count Schultz nodded, and then said in a warning tone, "You'd better be respectful in front of that guy." "Do you really think he's the Duke of St. Hilda?" Lucian sneered. "Except for his appearance, his attitude, his tone, and some of his habits are completely different from the real Duke of St. Hilda. Although I don't know what's going on with his appearance, he can't fool those who really know the Duke of St. Hilda." Count Schultz said with a deep meaning, "He has the face of a duke, and he has the strength of a duke. Why can't he be the Duke of St. Hilda?" "Strength?" The look on Lucian's face became even more disdainful. "With his current condition, I can chop his head off in an hourglass." Never underestimate the power of a saint knight, Lucien. Count Schultz's face became serious. Even though he's still injured, if you really dare to provoke him, you won't end well. Seeing that Lucien was still not convinced, Count Schultz's eyes became serious. You promised me, Lucien. Don't go back on your words. Of course I remember my promise. I just hope you won't forget yours. Lucien responded coldly. Count Schultz looked into his husband's eyes seriously and nodded. Of course I won't forget. That's good. But I still have to remind you, don't be fooled by the title of Duchess. It's just an empty promise. Count Schultz nodded solemnly and said, Of course I know what I'm doing. I won't completely trust that Duke of St. Hilda, who I don't know if he's real or not. That's good. Lucien put on his half-taken armor again and said, You go deal with Viscount Angli first. I'll take care of the Duke of St. Hilda. Count Schultz nodded and walked out of the room. Swan Castle was a Gothic-style building with a large number of pointed roof designs. It was tall, thin, and thick. The outer walls were painted white, which complemented the green Swan Lake. It had a strong visual impact and was unforgettable. The castle was more than 30 meters high, with 7 floors and more than 200 rooms. It would take Lucien more than half a day to visit them one by one. Under the guidance of Count Schultz, Colin only skimmed through the castle. Viscount Angli, this is the main castle. There are 2 side castles behind, as well as warehouses, stables, farms, and so on. Do you want to continue? Standing in the main hall of Swan Castle, Colin glanced around, as if he was admiring the decorations around. Seeing Count Schultz pointing at the door, Lucien did not immediately go forward. Instead, he stamped his feet and asked with a smile, My lord, is there no basement under the main castle? Of course there is. At this time Lucien walked in. He must have just taken a shower and changed into a black suit. He smiled at Colin. There's a wine cellar and a storage room. Would you like to have a look, my lord Viscounts? Colin nodded his head and said, Of course. Chapter 333. Following the mottled stone steps, Colin followed Count Schultz to the basement of Swan Castle. 2 attendants led the way in front and lit up the braziers embedded in the stone wall in advance. The flames lit up the dark and gloomy corridor. Due to the lack of ventilation, the air in the basement was extremely turbid. The smell of wine, grass, and a faint smell of rot mixed together, making one feel suffocated. Soon, they reached the end of the corridor and arrived at a spacious underground space. Count Schultz pointed at the wooden doors in front of him and asked, Viscount Angli, there are 7 rooms here. Which one do you want to see first? Colin glanced around the wooden doors and pointed at the one in the middle casually. Is this the wine cellar? Yes. Count Schultz smiled gently. Also, it contains the most precious wine of Swan Castle. Then I would like to see it. Count Schultz nodded at the attendant calmly and signaled for him to open the door. With a slightly ear-piercing creak, the wooden door slowly opened, and a strong smell of wine wafted out. Colin's eyes lit up. He seemed to be attracted by the smell of wine and immediately strode in. Count Schultz also followed him in. At the same time, he pointed at the rows of wine shelves in the room and introduced them. Viscount Angli, these are the best wines from the Winst Highlands. The deeper you go, the older they are. If you like, you can pick one for the banquet later. I don't know much about wine. Why don't you pick one for me? As Colin walked in, he looked around casually, as if he was really attracted by the wine in the room. But in fact, he had already smelled the familiar faint smell of blood. Bishop John's disappearance was indeed related to the Schultz family. Also, the Schultz family and the Morrison family were probably related. He just didn't know why they kidnapped Bishop John. Viscount Angli, if I were you, I would pick that row of wine. Count Schultz pointed at the wine shelf in the middle of the room and said with a smile. Colin asked curiously, why? First of all, grape wine isn't suitable for immediate consumption when it's just produced. It's best to store it for 4 to 5 years to get rid of its sourness. The wine in this row is the work of the Winst Manor from 4 years ago. Furthermore, the weather that year was warm, and the precipitation was abundant. The quality of the grapes was very good, and I believe that you will be able to taste the most wonderful flavor. After listening to Count Schultz's explanation, Colin nodded, not fully understanding. He strode forward, ready to pick a random one and leave. Anyway, he had already achieved the goal of this trip. He had confirmed that the Schultz family was indeed scheming as he had guessed. However, just as he picked a bottle of wine and was about to leave, he caught sight of the other side of the wine rack from the corner of his eye. His entire body froze in that instant. Viscount Angley, have you made your choice? Count Schultz looked at the motionless Colin and asked in confusion. However, Colin was still staring at the wine rack in a daze, as if he did not hear Count Schultz's question. Count Schultz exchanged a glance with Lucien, who was standing next to him. Their eyes were full of confusion, but they still strode forward. Then, both of them were stunned. This was because a corpse was lying abruptly behind the row of wine racks. The dead body seemed to have been drained of blood. The face was pale and haggard, but they could still tell that it was Bishop John, who had been missing for many days. Count Schultz's eyes were wide open. He immediately looked at Lucien, as if he was questioning him. What the hell did you do? Lucien's eyebrows were tightly knitted, and his eyes were full of confusion and grievance. He really wanted to tell his wife that he had already reminded that guy to move. However, he did not know that the guy had left out the most important thing. No, it was not a mistake. He did it on purpose. Count Schultz felt a chill running down his spine. He finally understood the sinister intention of the Duke of St. Hilda. Since Vera did not enter the city, Duke of St. Hilda must have realized that his original plan had been seen through. Therefore, he immediately changed his plan and betrayed Count Schultz without any hesitation. Colin had already found the dead body. What should he do now? Count Schultz's mind was in a mess. Countless ideas popped up in his mind, but none of them were reliable. Colin was also dumbfounded at this moment. He did not expect that they would really find Bishop John's dead body in the basement of Swan Castle. When he proposed to visit Swan Castle earlier, he did not intend to find Bishop John at all. He only wanted to confirm whether the Schultz family had anything to do with the disappearance of Bishop John. The only way to confirm this was through the special smell of blood. However, he did not expect that things would turn out like this. He had given the Schultz family so much time to clean up the scene, but they were really stupid enough to leave Bishop John's dead body in the basement. Normally, Colin should be happy that the case of Bishop John's disappearance was solved. However, at this moment he was not happy at all. Colin was completely locked down by the strong pressure coming from behind him. He knew that the young man was going to kill him. As his mind raced, Colin slowly turned around. He revealed a stiff smile and said, "I'm sorry. Count, I did not expect that the murderer of Bishop John would be so cunning and sinister." Count Schultz looked at Colin with a poker face and asked, "Oh, why do you say that?" "Because he left Bishop John's dead body in the basement of Swan Castle. It's obvious that he wanted to frame the Schultz family. Don't you think he's sinister?" Count Schultz was a bit surprised, but he immediately understood what Colin meant. At this time, Count Schultz was also in a dilemma. He did not know how to deal with Colin. The fact that Bishop John's dead body was in the basement of Swan Castle made it very difficult for the Schultz family to explain to the church. Count Schultz did think of killing Colin, who was the witness, to cover up the case. However, she was also worried that doing so would infuriate the House of St. Hilda. The solution proposed by Colin seemed to work, but she still could not make up her mind. Count Schultz did not know whether such an excuse would work in front of the church, and whether the damn Duke of St. Hilda had any other tricks up his sleeve. Colin looked at Count Schultz, who was silent and whose facial expression was changing constantly, and reminded her carefully, "Count, don't make the wrong decision, and don't fall into the trap of the real murderer." Count Schultz bit her red lips and said in a low voice, "Viscount Angley, Bishop John's death has nothing to do with the Schultz family." "I believe you," Colin immediately said. "If you knew that Bishop John died here, you wouldn't have taken the initiative to bring me here to choose the wine." Count Schultz nodded and let out a long breath. Then she turned around and looked at Lucien, as if she was asking for his opinion. Lucien did not relax. The horrible power coming out of his body was like a big net, covering Colin in it. It seemed that if anything went wrong, a thunderous strike would fall on his head. Seeing this, Colin's heart sank. When he was about to explain again, a servant's voice came from outside the cellar. My lord, the city defense sent a message saying that the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier, Lady Ajani, has just arrived in Swan City. Ajani. The atmosphere in the cellar changed again. Chapter 334. In the dark basement, the atmosphere was heavy. Count Schultz had left in a hurry, presumably to welcome the arrival of Archbishop Ajani. So only Colin and Lucien were left here, facing each other. Mr. Lucien, are you going to kill me? Colin suddenly asked with a smile. Lucien did not answer. He just stared at Colin with his sharp eyes. Facing the terrifying pressure of a sixth-rank warrior, Colin was like a small boat in a stormy sea, which could capsize at any time. You don't dare to kill me, Colin said with a smile. I'm not a nobody. I'm the Viscounts of the Empire, the guardian of the Northern Frontier, and the husband of the Duke of St. Hilda. Hee, can your Schultz family bear the consequences of killing me? Lucien still did not say anything, but Colin caught a trace of doubt in his eyes. Colin knew what was going on. He tried to persuade Lucien again. I believe the Schultz family has its own difficulties. Why don't you tell me the truth? You don't have to worry that I'll blame the Schultz family for this. You have to believe that I've always been very tolerant of the lords of the Northern Frontier. Think about the Oman family and the Dawson family. They've made huge mistakes before, but they're still fine now. Lucien was still unmoved. Colin shrugged and said helplessly, You don't dare to kill me, but you don't want to let me go either. Mr. Lucien, you're not going to watch me like this for the rest of my life, are you? Why not? Lucien finally answered. Colin smiled faintly and joked. Okay, then you can accompany me in this dark basement for the rest of your life. With so much good wine here, I think the rest of my life won't be too boring. Lucien's face darkened, as if he had finally made up his mind. He said fiercely, I'm sorry, Viscount Angley. You'll have to suffer for a while. Following his words, Colin immediately felt that the atmosphere in the cellar had changed. If it was a storm before, now it was a complete mess. Wait. Lucien. Boom. Before Colin could finish speaking, he saw the shadow of a fist rapidly enlarging in front of him. An irresistible force, accompanied by a violent whistling sound, fiercely attacked his chest. The surrounding air also became stagnant. Colin felt as though he was trapped in a huge net. Every movement required a great deal of effort. Unable to dodge, he could only use his hands to protect his chest. Rumble. Bursting holy light and surging combat aura suddenly exploded between the two of them. Circles of ripples spread out, shaking the entire wine cellar. All of the wine exploded in an instant, and the overflowing wine aroma filled the small space. Crack. Amidst the heart-palpitating sound of bones breaking, Colin only felt a sharp pain coming from his hands. He couldn't help but let out a blood-curdling scream. His entire body was violently sent flying by the shockwave, crashing into the wall on the side. Lucien immediately caught up with Colin. Gathering the horrifying power in both of his fists, he once again bombarded Colin's legs. After another series of bone-cracking sounds, Colin completely collapsed on the ground, sweating profusely and gasping for breath. However, he didn't look too panicked. Instead, he twitched the corner of his mouth, revealing a mocking smile, and said with difficulty, Hee, if you really have the guts, just kill me right now. Or, I'll make you wish you were dead. Looking at Colin's broken limbs, Lucien seemed to finally be relieved. He said lightly, Lord Viscounts, please be patient and stay here for a while. When the Schultz family finds out the real culprit behind Bishop John's murder, we'll come and apologize to you. After saying this, Lucien no longer cared about Colin, turned around and strode away. Out of the cellar, Lucien glanced at the two guards outside the door and said, Guard this place well. Except for the Count and me. Don't let anyone come close. Yes. The two guards hurriedly replied. They also heard the noise in the cellar just now. They were not stupid and had already guessed some things, but they didn't dare to ask more questions. After Lucien's figure disappeared at the end of the stone steps, the cellar returned to silence. But not long after, a series of cracking sounds came from the cellar, as if the wine bottles were broken, followed by a horrifying scream. Then the cellar returned to silence. The two guards looked at each other and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. "What's going on?" One of them couldn't help but ask in a low voice. "I don't know." The other one shook his head, and a trace of worry appeared on his face. "That person. Nothing happened to him, right?" Of course they knew who the person inside was, and they also knew that the person was of noble status. "If anything happened, should I go in and take a look?" "Yes, go ahead. I'll guard the door for you." One of the guards then pushed the door open and entered the cellar. The cellar was in a mess. Collapsed wine shelves and broken wine bottles were everywhere, and the air was filled with the strong smell of wine. And at the innermost corner of the cellar, Viscount Angley was lying on the ground, motionless. "Sir Viscounts?" The guard called out a few times, but he didn't get any response. He carefully walked forward and called out a few more times, but there was still no response from Colin. The guard was a little flustered. He bent down and patted Colin's shoulder. "Viscounts, swish." In an instant Colin, who had been motionless, suddenly raised his head and opened his bloody mouth. His ferocious fangs shone with a cold light under the dim candlelight. "Ah!" The guard let out a short cry, and then he found that all his strength and blood were rapidly flowing out of his body through the arm that was bitten by Angley. He opened his mouth wide and wanted to shout for help, but he found that he could only make a low huff, huff sound. As the blood was sucked in, Colin's body rapidly swelled. His broken bones were also healing at an unnatural speed. A pair of large bat wings extended from his back, instantly filling up the small space in the cellar. Seeing that his companion didn't respond, the guard outside carefully opened the door to the cellar. And then he saw a scene that he would never forget. In the dining hall on the 3rd floor of Swan Castle, a young maid walked in with light steps, serving plate after plate of delicacies on the long table. Count Schultz had an elegant smile on his face as he said politely, "Your Excellency, it must have been hard for you to come all the way to Swan City. Please have a taste of the delicacies that the Schultz family has prepared for you." Akani smiled and thanked the Count. Her beautiful eyes glanced around the hall, and she asked curiously, "Count Schultz, I met Mr. Schultz on my way back from Dragon City." "Count, I met Duke St. Hilda on the way here. She told me that Viscount Angeli stayed in Swan City to help with the investigation of Bishop John's disappearance. Why didn't I see him?" Count Schultz's expression did not change. He smiled and said, "Your Excellency, it's a pity that the Viscounts just left this afternoon." "Really? That's a pity." Akani nodded, as if she believed the Count. "Then what about your husband? He's not in Swan Castle either?" Akani asked again. When Count Schultz was thinking about how to explain, he saw a figure walking into the dining hall from the corner of his eye. He immediately smiled and said, "Lucien, what took you so long? The Archbishop just asked about you." Lucien walked into the dining hall and bowed to Akani. He explained with a smile, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency. Just now, a thief sneaked into the basement and wanted to steal some wine. I went to deal with him. That's why I'm late." Akani stood up and bowed back. She smiled and said, "A thief dares to steal from Swan Castle? How bold." "I know, right? Maybe it's because the wine in Swan Castle's cellar is too famous that it attracted greedy eyes." Count Schultz smiled and said. As they talked and laughed, the atmosphere of the banquet gradually became more lively. However, not long after, the butler hurried in and whispered something in Lucien's ear. Then Lucien's face changed. "What's wrong?" Akani asked curiously. Lucien smiled and pretended to be calm. He said, "Nothing. I just didn't expect that the thief who stole the wine had an accomplice who saved him." Then he wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. "I'm really sorry, Your Excellency. I have to go catch the thief who escaped. I'm afraid I won't be able to enjoy the rest of the dinner with you." Akani was confused. "Mr. Lucien, it's just a thief. Do you really need to go catch him yourself? That thief has some skills, and the family guards have disappointed me too much. So, I still have to chase after him personally. I've made a fool of myself." Akani smiled and waved her hand, indicating that Count Schultz could do as he pleased. Lucien then winked at Count Schultz and strode out of the dining hall. Count Schultz was very nervous, but on the surface he forced himself to be calm. He tried to say in a relaxed tone, Your Excellency, don't worry about Lucien. Your Grace, you don't have to worry about Lucien. Let's enjoy the banquet. Akane took a deep look at the Countess beside her and smiled. Okay. Chapter 335. When Lucien returned to the basement, the first thing he saw was a pile of dead bodies. The bodies of the guards of the Schultz family. As for Colin and Bishop John, their corpses had already disappeared. Lucien tried his best to suppress his anger and asked the butler, What happened? The butler explained carefully. My lord, I was not there, but the guard who came to report to me said that not long after you left, there was a scream in the basement. Then the guards in the hall went into the basement to check, and one of them was sent to report to me. I came here as soon as I received the report, but I found that the 30 guards who went into the basement were all killed, and Viscount Angley was nowhere to be found. However, I guess that they haven't escaped from Swan Castle yet. Lucien's eyes lit up, and he quickly asked, Oh? Why? Because the guards did not find anyone going in or out of the castle. So unless they can fly, they must still be in the castle. Okay. Send people to search the whole castle. Yes, my lord. When the first ray of the morning sun shone on the castle, Lucien was still standing at the entrance of the basement, in the same posture as last night. Lucien heard the familiar footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw Count Schultz walking towards him with a cup of coffee. Do you want to take a rest? Count Schultz handed the coffee to his husband and asked. No thanks. Lucien shook his head and drank the coffee in one gulp. Although he did not sleep last night, it did not seem to affect him much. He was still in high spirits. However, the worry in his eyes did not disappear. Seeing this, Count Schultz felt even more depressed. He asked still nothing. Lucien shook his head. When he was about to say something, the captain of the guards, Knight Brett, hurried over. Knight Brett was refreshed and asked, How is it? Did you find anything? Knight Brett saluted first and then reported, My lord Mr. Lucien, the guards have finished searching the castle, but they still did not find Viscount Angley. However, we found some blood stains on the wall on the east side of the castle. Count Schultz asked anxiously, So they escaped from Swan Castle from there? That should be the case. Lucien frowned and asked in an unfriendly tone, Then tell me, how did they climb over the wall without alerting the patrolling guards? Furthermore, you're carrying a cripple with broken limbs? Knight Brett was stunned. He lowered his head and said, I don't know. Lucien snorted and ordered, Inform the city guards immediately to close all the gates of the castle. No one is allowed in or out. You will personally lead a team of guards and follow me to search the city. Sir, my lord, said Knight Brett to be prepared. Count Schultz's brow furrowed. Who saved Viscount Angeli? Is it the Duke of St? Lucien's face was gloomy as he said coldly, No matter who it is, I will bring them back. The night of the castle to the castle to the castle to the castle. The hazy moonlight shone through the window and filled the room. Countess Schultz had just finished bathing. Her hair was still slightly damp. She was wearing white silk pajamas and sitting in front of the dressing table. Looking at herself in the mirror, the countess suddenly sighed. Her beautiful face was filled with unconcealable worry. It had been 3 days since Colin escaped from the basement. Over the past 3 days, Lucien had personally led a team to turn Swan City upside down, but they still could not find Colin's whereabouts. This morning, Lucien was certain that Colin had escaped from Swan City, so he led 3,000 men to chase after him. In the evening, a messenger came back with good news. Lucien had found traces of Colin, and it would not be long before they were captured. Logically speaking, such good news should have made Count Schultz feel at ease. However, after receiving this news, the Countess had an ominous premonition. After thinking in front of the mirror for a long time, Countess Schultz shouted to the door, Mary? She waited for a while, but there was no response from the maid who was supposed to be guarding the door. Countess Schultz frowned and was about to stand up to check, but at this time, a gust of wind suddenly rushed in through the open window. Whoosh! The candle was blown out, and the whole room was shrouded in darkness. Countess Schultz's heart skipped a beat. When she was about to shout, she found that the back of her neck was tightly gripped by a big hand. "Don't make a sound, Countess." Hearing the familiar voice behind her, Countess Schultz's heart almost jumped out of her throat. She tried to keep calm and forced a smile. "Viscount Angley, where have you been? We've been worried about you for a long time." Colin turned around and stood in front of Countess Schultz. Under the soft moonlight, he looked at the beautiful Countess in front of him from head to toe. Their posture was quite ambiguous, as if they were lovers hugging each other under the moonlight. Of course, if Colin's big hand was not gripping the back of Countess Schultz's neck tightly. "Countess Schultz, I can't accept your husband's hospitality, so I chose to stay away from him for now." "Viscount Angley, I apologize for what Lucien did to you before. But please believe me, the Schultz family means you and the House of St. Hilda no harm. If you're still angry, I can make it up to you." Countess Schultz's tone became ambiguous, and her body slowly moved closer to Colin. Facing the seduction of this mature and beautiful countess, Colin was not moved at all. He even increased the strength of his hand, as if he was going to crush Countess Schultz's delicate and slender neck. "Ah!" Countess Schultz groaned in pain, and she did not dare to do it again. She only looked at Colin with her big, watery eyes as if she had been wronged. The touch of tenderness and charm in her eyes seemed to be able to melt steel. Unfortunately, it was unable to move Colin. He only heard him coldly say. Instead he said coldly, "Countess Schultz, please tell me the truth." "Viscount Angley, I admit that Lucien did go too far, but he was just worried that you might misunderstand the Schultz family." "Misunderstand?" Colin sneered and interrupted Countess Schultz's sophistry. "Don't tell me that you had nothing to do with Bishop John's death. And don't tell me that you didn't try to trick Vera into coming to the city. Also, do you really think that I don't know who Vera's real mother is?" Countess Schultz's heart skipped a beat. She finally understood why she was exposed. She wanted nothing more than to tear that damned Duke St. Hilda to shreds. Not only did that impostor give her a lousy idea, he even pushed the Schultz family into a fire pit when he saw that things were going south. Perhaps from the very beginning, this Duke of St. Hilda wanted the Schultz family to become enemies with the House of St. Hilda. Countess Schultz found herself in a dilemma. It was impossible for her to lie. After all, Colin had seen through her trick from the very beginning. However, she did not dare to tell the truth. The Schultz family could not bear the consequences of telling the truth. She had pretended to be the mother of the Dukes of the North and helped to murder Bishop John. Countess Schultz did not believe that Colin, or the House of St. Hilda, would let her go. Looking at the struggling Countess Schultz, Colin opened his mouth again. "Countess Schultz, as I said before, I am a merciful person. As long as you are willing to tell the truth, I will forgive all your sins. So I'll give you one more chance. If you dare to lie again, then don't blame me for being ruthless." Countess Schultz's expression changed rapidly. After a long time, she sighed and said, "Viscount Angley, please believe me. Bishop John's death has nothing to do with the Schultz family. You must not be fooled by such a clumsy method. Also, I am really Vera's biological mother. I even dared to confront Marquis Garcia face to face." Sigh. Colin let out a long sigh. It seemed that he had completely lost his trust in the Countess. He said coldly, "Ask for forgiveness for the sins you have committed." After saying that, he stabbed a dagger into Countess Schultz's heart. Woo! Before Countess Schultz could cry out in pain, Colin covered her throat. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. Obviously, she did not expect that Colin would actually dare to kill her. After all, she was the Countess of the Northern Frontier. She was also the wife of a Sixth-Order warrior. Was Colin not afraid of revenge? After the intense pain, Countess Schultz felt a surge of powerlessness. She could only feel the light in front of her fading little by little. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to leave something behind for the world, but no sound came out. Before she completely lost consciousness, Countess Schultz felt as if her neck had been bitten. Chapter 336. Countess Schultz felt like she had just had a long dream. In her dream, she saw the God of Light. The God of Light touched her forehead gently, as if he had said something. However, Countess Schultz found that she could not hear the god of light clearly. It was as if something had cut off the connection between her and the god of light, preventing them from communicating. Opening her eyes, Countess Schultz found that she was still in her bedroom in Swan Castle. With the help of the dim moonlight shining through the window, she could clearly see Colin sitting in a chair in front of her, calmly looking at her. Countess Schultz felt that she should have felt fear, but in fact, Colin seemed to be shrouded in a layer of holy light at this moment. In a trance, the image of the god of light that she had seen in her dream overlapped with the face of the young viscounts in front of her. This discovery made Countess Schultz inexplicably horrified, but a deep reverence and admiration rooted in the depths of her blood uncontrollably welled up in her heart, making Countess Schultz only want to worship Colin. What happened to me? Countess Schultz's eyes were hazy, and she asked in a dreamy tone. Colin sat upright on the chair, looking down at Countess Schultz, who had collapsed on the ground, and said indifferently, "You just died. You've just died, but I've forgiven you, so I've granted you rebirth." Rebirth? Countess Schultz's face was filled with disbelief, but when she lowered her head, she saw the dagger that was still inserted in her heart. "Pull it out yourself." Colin's indifferent voice sounded again. Countess Schultz's hands trembled as she grasped the handle of the dagger. Her heart was filled with fear, but she did not hesitate to follow Colin's orders. Whoosh! The dagger was pulled out. Countess Schultz cried out in pain, but she did not see the blood splattering everywhere as she had expected. Moreover, she even felt that this wound that should have been fatal did not exist at all. "From now on, you will be bathed in the grace of the god of light, and you will not die so easily." Colin opened his mouth again and tried to trick him. Perhaps even Pope Gregory himself might not be able to do a better job than him. The fear on Countess Schultz's face was gradually replaced by devotion. She prostrated herself on the ground and said, "Praise the Lord." Raising his head again, Count Schultz looked at Colin with eyes full of reverence. "Are you God's chosen one?" he asked. Colin nodded and said, "Yes, but you should keep my identity to yourself. You are not allowed to tell anyone else." "I understand." Count Schultz nodded. After experiencing the miracle that happened to him, Count Schultz had unreserved trust in Colin. Colin carefully observed every tiny change of Count Schultz. He wanted to see if transforming into a blood descendant could really turn an enemy into a friend. After all, the blood descendants had self-awareness. That was why Colin had been very careful to avoid converting them into enemies. He was worried that the blood descendants would show respect on the surface, but betray him behind his back. Now it seemed like Count Schultz had been brainwashed. He no longer had any hostility towards Colin. However, Colin could not make a conclusion yet. He still needed to verify it further. "Tell me, what's going on with Bishop John? Who asked you to pretend to be Vera's biological mother?" Faced with the same question again, Count Schultz decisively did not quibble anymore. Instead, he said honestly, "It all started 10 days ago. At that time, a man who looked exactly like the previous Duke of St. Hilda suddenly came to me." "The Duke of St. Hilda?" Colin's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but exclaim in surprise. Yes. Although he looked exactly like the previous Duke, there was a big difference in his tone and demeanor. Of course I could tell. It was only because this man also had the strength of a paladin that I did not dare to resist. I could only follow his orders. This man must have been injured, so he asked us to help him catch Bishop John and heal him. Also, he knew a lot of secrets about the House of St. Hilda, including Vera's background. That was why he asked me to pretend to be Vera's biological mother. He said that there was no need to worry about me being exposed, because Vera's real mother did not even dare to acknowledge her as her daughter. Hearing Count Schultz's story, Colin frowned and asked, "What happened after that? How did Bishop John's body end up in the basement of Swan Castle?" "When we saw John's body, Lucien and I were also quite shocked. I asked Lucien to warn that man, and he also knew that you were going to search the whole castle. I thought that he would hide somewhere else for the time being, but who would have thought that he would betray you all?" Colin immediately understood. Count Schultz nodded. Yes. I think he saw that the Duke did not enter Swan City, and he felt that the Schultz family had lost its value. So he decided to provoke the conflict between us and the House of St. Hilda. Colin thought for a while and asked again, "Do you have any contact with the Morrison family?" The Morrison family? Count Schultz was a bit surprised that Colin would suddenly mention this family. He paused for a second and then shook his head. "We've never been close to the Morrison family, and we haven't had any contact with them recently." Colin was very cautious about Count Schultz's frankness. He could not check the consciousness of his bloodkin, so he did not know whether she was lying or not. However, judging from what Count Schultz said earlier, Colin was inclined to believe that she was telling the truth. After all, if she wanted to lie, she would not have made up a story about the Duke of St. Hilda coming back from the dead. It was too unbelievable. If she was telling the truth, then what was going on with this Duke of St. Hilda? Could it be that the Morrison family had really resurrected the Duke of St. Hilda? Colin could not help but think of the strange blood pool under the clock tower of Phoenix Butterfly Castle. But then he remembered that Count Schultz had said that this Duke of St. Hilda's demeanor, tone, habits, and so on were different from the real Duke. So perhaps he had not come back from the dead, but came back from the dead in someone else's body. At this moment, Colin suddenly remembered Prince Lexi's reminder that Mr. Chi was not dead. Thinking of this, those isolated doubts seemed to be strung together by a string. Although this conjecture was too unbelievable, it seemed to be the most reasonable explanation. Mr. Chi had used the corpse of the Duke of St. Hilda to come back to life. Colin suddenly felt a bone-piercing chill. That terrifying person who had plunged the northern frontier into misery and suffering was actually still hiding in some corner, and could come out at any time to stir up another bloody storm. Perhaps, the Schultz family was the result of the other party's small experiment. Colin narrowed his eyes and forced himself to calm down. He knew that Mr. Chi was not invulnerable. At least, the other party only dared to hide in the shadows now, even if he had already taken over the body of a holy knight. That's right. Although he had successfully come back from the dead in someone else's body, the Duke of St. Hilda had suffered heavy injuries before his death. No wonder he wanted to kidnap Bishop John. He probably wanted Bishop John to treat his injuries. Colin immediately became alert. He had to inform the church of this matter. If Mr. Chi wanted to recover from his injuries, he would definitely kidnap more high-ranking priests of the church. In addition, he also thought of Prince Lexi. Wasn't this person tracking Mr. Chi all over the world? If he revealed this information to him, presumably this holy knight of the San Lorenzo family would be willing to help the northern frontier get rid of this evil. Thinking of this, Colin finally let out a sigh of relief. His gaze once again returned to Count Schultz. The Countess, who had been preparing to sleep, was now wearing a simple corset dress. She did not have any jewelry on her, but the dress was well tailored, vividly outlining her exquisite curves. The semicircular neckline revealed her delicate collarbone and snow-white skin. Coupled with her current submissive posture, it accentuated her mature, beautiful, and seductive charm. Colin forcibly retracted his gaze, suppressing the restlessness in his heart. Colin still needed to give this blood descendant, who had been transformed from an enemy, a final test. He really wanted to know if this blood descendant would betray him. Count Schultz, next I need you to do this. Chapter 337. The sun was setting in the west, and the sky was getting dark. The guards of the Schultz family had set up a temporary camp on a small hill. They had left Swan City for 4 days, and in these 4 days, the area within a radius of a few hundred miles around Swan City had been thoroughly searched, but there was still nothing to be found. Lucien's patience seemed to be running out, and his temper was getting worse. Seeing this, the guards all avoided this lord, and even their footsteps were much lighter, afraid that they would get into trouble and become the target of his anger. Bonfires rose in the camp, and the orange tongues of the flames licked at the mutton on the iron rack, but they only tasted the hot oil dripping down. Lucien sat in front of the bonfire expressionlessly, and took a golden roasted leg of mutton. Ignoring the heat, he began to bite into it. The retainer hurriedly and carefully handed over the wine flask, and then retreated. After a few steps, the faint sound of horse hooves could be heard from the entrance of the camp, and then a messenger hurried over. Lucien frowned at the man's attire and asked, "You're from Swan City?" The messenger hurriedly stepped forward and bowed, saying, "Yes, my lord. The Count has sent me to deliver a letter to you." As he spoke, he passed the letter to Lucien. Lucien opened it and saw that it was indeed a letter from Count Schultz himself. After quickly skimming through it, he stood up in surprise, his face filled with undisguised ecstasy. Seeing this, the retainer tactfully asked, "My lord, is there any good news?" "We've found him, and he's actually hiding in Swan Castle." "Haha, my initial guess was right. I was almost fooled," Lucien said excitedly. "Congratulations, my lord. Pass down my orders, rest for the night, and return to Swan City tomorrow." "Yes, my lord." Swan Castle. Archbishop Ajani was led into a guest hall by a maid. However, she did not see Count Schultz, who had invited her here. Instead, she saw someone else. Viscount Angley? Ajani looked at Colin in surprise. Didn't you already leave Swan City?" Colin smiled bitterly and said, "Sigh, someone doesn't want me to leave just like that." Akani pointed at the wheelchair under Colin and asked, "Are you injured?" Colin pretended to sigh and nodded his head. Then he pointed at a corner of the living room with his chin and said, "I'm quite lucky. What happened to Cardinal John was truly regrettable." Only then did Ajani notice that there was a coffin in the living room. She seemed to have realized something and walked over with a grave expression. Then she saw Bishop John lying inside the coffin. "Who did this?" Ajani's tone turned cold. "Lucien." "Lucien?" Ashani cried out in surprise. In addition to anger, there was also a trace of fear that could not be concealed. "That's right." Colin nodded and said solemnly, "Lucien colluded with outsiders and killed Cardinal John. After I discovered the clues, I was wounded and imprisoned in the basement. Fortunately, Count Schultz found out in time and rescued me." Ajani's eyes flashed. She asked doubtfully, "So, Count Schultz betrayed her husband and saved you?" As a devout believer of light, an upright knight of the northern region, and an honorable count of the empire, she has chosen to abandon the darkness and embrace the light. "Is there a problem with that?" Colin asked with a straight face. "Of course not." Ajani suppressed her doubts and asked, "Then, what about Count Schultz? Can I see her?" "She's right next door, waiting for Lucien's return." Ajani's expression changed. She asked somewhat nervously, "What does she want?" Of course, she wants to question her husband why he betrayed his faith and glory. Ajani looked at Colin's righteous face and her heart was filled with doubt. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Lucien is a rank 6 warrior. If he's angered," Colin snorted and interrupted her. "Your Excellency, are you afraid of the tyrannical power of a rank 6 warrior?" Ajani took a deep breath and regained her composure. She said, "Of course not. Under the glory of our Lord, no evil can escape from the judgment." "That's good." Colin looked at the Archbishop in front of him with a smile. "Count Schultz will expose Lucien's crime later and draw a clear line between them. The reason why I invited you here is that I hope you can be a witness." "Okay." Seeing Colin's calm face, Ajani seemed to have realized something, so she stopped worrying. After thinking for a while, Ajani asked again, "You said that Lucien colluded with outsiders to murder Cardinal John. Who is this outsider? And why did he murder Cardinal John?" "It's the former Duke of St. Hilda." "Who?" Ajani thought Colin was joking. But Colin said seriously, "That's right. The Duke of St. Hilda, who was supposed to be dead, has come back to life. However, I suspect that the one who came back to life is not the Duke himself, but Mr. Shui, who used some unknown forbidden spell to take over the Duke's body and come back to life." Ajani's eyes widened as she stared blankly at Colin. She obviously felt that everything he said was too unbelievable. Seeing this, Colin added calmly, "This is just my guess. It's up to you to believe it or not. However, I'm sure you know that Prince Lacey is currently at the northern frontier, and the reason he is here is because of Mr. Shui." Ajani fell into deep thought. She knew that the Duke of St. Hilda's body was stolen. After all, she was the one who personally presided over his funeral. Moreover, she had also heard about Prince Lacey. Therefore, even though Colin's guess was somewhat shocking, Ajani felt that it was very likely to be the truth of the matter. Thinking of this, her expression became extremely serious. She said in a low voice, "If Mr. Shui has really taken over the body of a holy knight, then this matter is far more terrifying than you can imagine. I have to report this to His Holiness the Pope immediately." That's right. In order to treat the injuries on the Duke of St. Hilda's body, Mr. Shui will definitely continue to kidnap high-ranking priests of the church. You have to be prepared. Not only that, if Mr. Shui really has a perfect body of a holy knight, then no one will be able to control him. Colin's expression changed. He asked why. Ajani hesitated for a moment, then said vaguely, "The mages of mages are too powerful. The power of a mage's forbidden spell is too terrifying. The only thing that can restrict them now is that their bodies can't withstand the backlash of the forbidden spell. However, if Mr. Shui has a perfect body of a holy knight, then he may not have to worry about the backlash of the forbidden spell." Colin's heart skipped a beat. He said in shock, "Could it be that the body of a holy knight can withstand the backlash of the forbidden spell? At least it won't be as weak as a mortal's body. Even if there is some damage, it can be repaired. If Mr. Shui used the sacrificial method in Fallen Eagle City to share some of the backlash, I'm afraid that he will no longer be able to be restricted. A holy mage who could cast forbidden spells without any fear. Just the thought of it was terrifying." The atmosphere became extremely heavy for a moment. Just as the two of them were deep in thought, footsteps came from the room next door. Colin and Ajani immediately looked at each other, silently exchanging their thoughts. Lucian is back. Chapter 338. Where is he? Where did you find him? Who's the one who rescued him? Lucian asked Count Schultz as soon as he entered the room. Instead of answering her husband's question, Count Schultz handed over a roll of parchment to Lucian. Lucian took over the parchment in confusion. After a quick glance, his face changed greatly. What's the meaning of this? Count Schultz slowly turned around and took a sip of the coffee on the table. He said coldly, "It means what it says on the paper. I want to divorce you." Lucian clenched the divorce paper tightly in his hand. His eyes were filled with the light of brutality. "Why?" Count Schultz avoided Lucian's fierce gaze and said calmly, "Because I can't tolerate you going on like this. The glory of the Schultz family can't be tarnished because of you." Lucian sneered and said mockingly, "Is this my fault? Back then, it was clearly the two of us who made the decision together. Now that you want to withdraw from it, isn't it too whimsical?" Count Schultz shook his head slowly. "No, Lucian. It was you who forced me to make the decision. It was you who allowed Bishop John to be kidnapped and murdered. It was you who broke Viscount Angley's limbs and tried to imprison him in the basement. You should be the one to bear all these crimes." Lucian suddenly burst out laughing, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. After a while he slowly approached Count Schultz and said, "You want to put all these crimes on me? Hee hee. Do you really think I'll let you do whatever you want?" Grabbing Countess Schultz's smooth chin, Lucian stared into her eyes and asked, "What happened in the past few days when I was away? Tell me." Count Schultz looked at Lucian, who was on the verge of exploding, fearlessly. Her tone was still indifferent. "Lucian, since we were once husband and wife, I'll let you live. Sign this divorce paper and run for your life." "Run for my life?" Lucian sneered again. "If I just walk away like this, wouldn't I be confirming the accusation that you framed me? At that time, I'll really be the one who murdered Bishop John and imprisoned Viscount Angley." Seeing that the other party had seen through his scheme, Count Schultz's eyes flashed with a hint of panic, but he quickly calmed down. "What else can you do? Kill me? That will only make you fall into the abyss of eternal damnation." Lucian slowly squeezed Count Schultz's chin harder. The killing intent in Lucian's eyes was not hidden at all, and he threatened Count Schultz. "You want to destroy me? Do you think I'll just surrender? Even though you're a level 6 warrior, you're still just a commoner. Who's going to believe you even if you try to defend yourself?" Count Schultz sneered. "Even though you're a level 6 warrior, you're still just a commoner. I'm a Count of the Empire, and Viscount Angley and the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier are my witnesses. Who do you think will be convicted of those crimes? So the only way out for you now is to get out of Swan City and never come back to the northern frontier again. Lucien looked at the woman in front of him, who had been with him for more than 20 years, and found it hard to accept that she would betray him so easily. The look in Lucien's eyes was getting more and more dangerous, and his breathing was getting heavier and heavier. It seemed that he was going to crush Count Schultz's skull in the next second. However, facing such a real death threat, Count Schultz did not flinch at all. Instead, she stared straight at her husband, as if he was already a dead man. The two confronted each other for a long time. Finally, Lucien flinched. "Tell me, what on earth happened?" Lucien asked. Count Schultz's eyes were blurred, and he said sincerely, "I met the Lord of Light and was inspired by him. That's why I made up my mind to cut off all the sins of the past." Bullsh*T. Lucien was furious. Obviously, he did not believe this kind of Bullsh*T. "You have to think clearly. I'm your biggest support. If you kick me out, you'll be at the mercy of Colin. No matter what he promised you before. How can you guarantee that he won't go back on his words? Think about the Oman family and the Dawson family. Yes, although these two families seem to have not been punished, and their titles and territories are still there. What about the previous Earl Oman and Marquis Dawson? Don't you know what happened to them? Don't be fooled by that brat Colin. He's not a kind and benevolent savior, but a vicious and merciless ambitious schemer." However, his words did not wake Countess Schultz up. She continued to stare at her husband with cold eyes and said indifferently, "You're right. Sign the divorce papers, and I'll let you go. You can also take Soren with you." Hearing his son's name, Lucien could not suppress the anger in his heart again. He said fiercely, "Where's Colin? Does he not dare to come out to see me? Who says I don't dare to see you?" As soon as Lucien finished his words, he saw Colin in a wheelchair being pushed into the room by Archbishop Ajani. Lucien's eyes instantly turned bloodshot when he saw his enemy. Facing this ferocious tiger that seemed to want to devour him, Colin didn't seem to feel threatened at all. He even added fuel to the fire by saying, "Mr. Lucien, I advise you to surrender. Don't make any unnecessary resistance." Lucien let go of Count Schultz and turned to Colin with a bloodthirsty smile. "You really think I don't dare to kill you? Then what are you waiting for?" Colin still had a fearless look on his face. "I already warned you in the basement that you'd better kill me. Otherwise, I'll make you suffer a fate worse than death." Hearing Colin's words, Archbishop Ajani frowned, as if she was afraid that Lucien would really lose his mind. "Mr. Lucien, violence can't solve anything. If you kill Viscount Angley, you'll only make yourself the public enemy of the northern frontier and the nobles. Even if you successfully escape with your strength, you'll only be able to survive in a dark corner. Your best choice now is to give up resistance and admit your sins. Our Lord is merciful. He's willing to give everyone who sincerely confesses a chance to redeem themselves." Lucien's lips curled into a mocking smile. Just as he was about to speak again, his expression suddenly changed, because he heard hurried footsteps outside the door. Obviously, a large number of Schultz family guards had gathered here. Seeing this, Colin said again, "Give up resistance, Lucien. You're just a grade 6 warrior. Do you really think you own Swan City just because you married an earl? See, you're now the enemy of this city. Aren't you proud of your superior strength? Kill everyone here if you have the ability. I only need one person to kill you." Lucien growled, his entire body turning into a bolt of lightning. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of Colin. He grabbed Colin by the collar and lifted him up from the wheelchair. He was about to mock him when he suddenly felt a sense of danger. A silver light flashed from Colin's hand, and like a venomous snake, it pierced towards Lucien's heart. Unfortunately, Lucien realized that something was wrong at the last moment. He twisted his body forcefully, avoiding his vital organs. *Chi. The dagger sank into his heart. But it did not pierce his heart. Lucien looked at Colin in shock. He had never imagined that Colin, whose limbs he had crushed 3 days ago, could recover in such a short time. Even the healing arts of the Northern Frontier's Archbishop could not have such an effect. "You've been tricked, haven't you?" Colin smiled smugly. Lucien's eyes flashed fiercely. With a roar, he punched out with his right hand. Bang! Colin flew out like a rag doll, blood spurting out of his mouth uncontrollably. At this time, the guards also rushed in, their swords pointed at the former owner of the castle. Lucien did not have time to check whether Colin was dead or not. He immediately ran to the window and jumped out. Quick! Don't let him get away! Count Schultz ordered loudly. He can't get away. Colin stood up shakily. His chest was obviously dented, but such a terrible injury did not seem to have any effect on him. Wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth, Colin also jumped out of the window. The guards also rushed out of the room. Akane didn't chase after him. Instead, she looked at Count Schultz with an inquisitive gaze. After a while she smiled. And said, "Your Excellency, your performance today really amazed me." Count Schultz smiled faintly and said, "What? Archbishop? Do you think I don't have the courage to face Lucien?" "No, I just think that not all women are like you, who can decisively cut off the relationship with her husband for the sake of justice. Under the guidance of my lord, I have nothing to fear." Akane looked at Count Schultz's pious face, and could not help but wonder what kind of promise Colin had made to Countess Schultz that made her betray Lucien. Even in the face of death, the Countess still dared to cut off the relationship with Lucien? What kind of secret was hidden in this? Chapter 339. In this season, the weather in the northern frontier was changeable. During the day, the sun was scorching hot, but at night, it was drizzling. Lightning flashed in the sky, and thunder rolled between the clouds. It seemed that the real storm was yet to come. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the wilderness and Lucien, who was running for his life. This peak warrior was in a sorry state. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were disheveled, and there was a dagger in his chest. Fresh blood stained his body, but he did not know how much of it was his own, and how much belonged to someone else. Although he had escaped Swan City, Lucien knew that he was not out of danger yet. He could vaguely feel that someone was staring at him. However, when he looked around, he couldn't find the source of this gaze. The rain was getting heavier, and Lucien could feel his strength draining away along with the wound on his chest. He was like a wounded beast, running for his life under the watchful eyes of a hunter. Hunters were very patient. They hid in the dark, waiting for the beast to weaken before striking the fatal blow. "I can't just sit here and wait for my death." Lucien made up his mind. He dismounted from his horse and stabbed the horses but with his sword. Under the pain, the war horse galloped even faster. Lucien hid in the bushes beside the road, holding his breath and waiting for the pursuers behind him. He was ready to fight back. Time passed little by little, but the expected pursuers still did not appear. Silver snakes danced in the sky, and a downpour followed. Even with Lucien's temperament as a peak warrior, he could not help but doubt his judgment. Could it be that there were no pursuers? Colin and Count Schultz let him go just like that? If that was the case, Lucien's eyes flashed with anger. He would not rest until he had his revenge. Just as Lucien was about to give up on the ambush and turn to leave, a ray of light seemed to appear in the darkness. "Who's there?" Lucien stopped and asked in a low voice. Darkness shrouded the land. Apart from the wind and rain, there was only silence. But not long after, the mud on the ground suddenly trembled slightly, and even the pebbles in the mud jumped up. A thunderous sound rang out in the distance, and in the blink of an eye, it became deafening, as if thousands of soldiers and horses had come out of the storm. This kind of aura seemed to have overshadowed the divine might of lightning. Lucien narrowed his eyes and looked at the group of cavalrymen who suddenly appeared not far away like a demon god. The 200 or so cavalrymen created a long tunnel in the dense rainwater. With the momentum of tearing the rain apart, the cavalry rushed toward Lucien. Lucien stood still, facing the cavalry squad that was charging at him as if the sky was falling and the earth was cracking. His face was still calm. Instead, he gripped the broadsword in his hand with both hands and waited for the incoming attack. Clang! However, when the cavalry was 500 steps away from Lucien, they suddenly dispersed. Just as Lucien was puzzled, Hundreds of arrows twisted in the rain like poisonous snakes, broke through the rain, and flew directly toward him. Facing the threat of the arrow rain, Lucien's eyes focused. The broadsword in his hand flashed, and the shadow of the sword opened up in front of him like a shield. After a series of clanging sounds, this round of arrow rain was all blocked. Before Lucien could catch his breath, 3 armored cavalrymen rushed toward him like tanks. Poochie! With a slash of the sword, the fierce sword light suddenly exploded. Broken limbs, blood and internal organs flew everywhere in the rain. This slash seemed to have changed the color of heaven and earth. Lucien was like a demon god who had come to destroy the world, destroying everything. However, his arrogant attitude did not last long, and he felt pain in his ankle. Looking down, Lucien realized that one of the 3 cavalrymen was still alive. But this person's body had been cut in 2, and he was still able to swing the sword in his hand and stab Lucien's ankle. Bam! Lucien kicked out, and the man's head exploded. Buzz buzz buzz. At this moment, another rain of arrows swept toward him. Lucien swung his sword again to block. After the rain of arrows, another 3 armored cavalrymen charged at him. Lucien realized that the enemy wanted to use this method to exhaust his strength. However, he did not have a good way to break it, because he had found that although the number of cavalrymen besieging him was not large, they were all professionals. Lucien guessed that these people should be the Angeli family's men of sacrifice, but he did not expect that such a family that had just risen for less than 2 years would have so many professionals. Moreover, he also found that these cavalrymen were really fearless of death. Some of them were seriously injured, and even cut in 2, but they still wanted to finish off Lucien. This kind of desperation made even Lucien feel a chill down his spine. After several rounds of arrows and the desperate charge of the cavalrymen, Lucien's strength was falling short of his desire, and several wounds had appeared on his body. A grade 6 warrior was not a god. First, he was ambushed by Colin, his chest was heavily injured, and then he fought his way out of Swan City. Now, under the repeated attacks of this group of fearless cavalrymen, he was at the end of his rope. Viscount Angli! Lucien finally could not help but shout. There is no unresolvable hatred between us. Why do you have to threaten me with death? Unfortunately, the only response he received was another round of arrows. Then a huge armored man holding a huge shield and a spear charged at Lucien like a violent bear. His heavy footsteps caused the earth to tremble. Lucien's eyes narrowed. Although there was only one person charging this time, and he did not have a horse, Lucien was facing a great enemy, and his expression became more serious than ever. Boom! The 2 collided head-on, and for a moment, the wind blew and the sound was ear-piercing. The rain that filled the sky suddenly exploded, and circles of water ripples suddenly bloomed like flowers in full bloom. A grade 5 troll warrior. The moment they clashed, Lucien discovered the identity of his opponent. Before he could figure out how Colin had sent a high-level troll warrior to kill him, there was a sudden commotion in the bushes. Lucien sensed danger and roared, the combat energy all over his body surging like flames. The air made a crisp sound like glass being broken, and the rain that filled the sky turned into countless fine lines, exploding in all directions. At this moment, a short armored man hiding in the bushes burst out, and the rain that filled the sky was like fine needles, instantly piercing his armor into a sieve. However, the armored man did not seem to feel anything, and continued to swing the huge hammer in his hand, smashing it at Lucien. Boom! Under the hammer, the ground splashed like water. Lucien spat out blood, and his sword-wielding hands could not help but tremble. A grade 5 dwarf warrior. Lucien was convinced that this was not a power that the Angeli family could have. Only the House of St. Hilda, the master of the northern frontier, could have such strength. So Lucien shouted again, I surrender. Honorable master of the northern frontier, as long as you are willing to give me a way out, I am willing to swear allegiance to you. Swish! Swish! A dense rain of arrows interrupted Lucien's pleas for mercy. What chilled him even more was that the rain of arrows also covered the 2 armored men, one big and one small, as if these enemies did not care about the lives of their companions at all, and the 2 armored men did not seem to care about their own lives either. They ignored the rain of arrows and rushed at Lucien again. Are you crazy? Lucien's face turned green. In his life he had experienced countless battles, big and small, and faced countless cruel and cunning enemies, but he had never seen such a strange way of fighting. The enemies in front of him seemed to be emotionless, painless, and unconscious killing machines. They were not afraid of death at all, and they only wanted to achieve one goal at all costs: kill Lucien. Chapter 340. Boom. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, tearing a gap in the darkness that shrouded the earth. Under the lightning, Lucien's veins bulged all over his body. He held his broadsword firmly in front of him, and arched his body to withstand the tremendous strength of the two armored men. The three of them were full of arrows, like 3 hedgehogs. Lucien's face was frighteningly pale. However, what made him even more desperate was that the two armored men opposite him were not weakened at all. It was as if the arrows in their bodies did not exist at all. The surging power kept hitting Lucien like a waterfall, pushing him back constantly. 2 deep gullies were plowed in the ground under his feet. Seeing that the cavalry patrolling around had drawn their bows again, ready for the next round of shooting, Lucien let out a roar like a trapped beast. With him as the center, a round of purple-black oval air waves suddenly bloomed. Boom! The 2 armored men were instantly sent flying. However, Lucien was not in a good state either. Streams of blood slowly flowed out of his eyes, mouth, nose, and ears. Ha! Laughter came out of Lucien's mouth. This peak warrior seemed to have foreseen his fate. But just like all dying beasts would fight back desperately, Lucien was also prepared for the worst. The warrior, who was covered in blood, let out a desperate and crazy roar. In that case, let's die together. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A new round of arrow rain came as expected, but this time, Lucien did not dodge at all. Countless shock waves exploded in the air in an instant, squeezing and shaking each other, and spreading out in all directions. The rain of arrows hit the circle of waves that seemed to be solid and suddenly exploded into powder. Lucien had already rushed to the 2 armored men, laughing wildly. The broadsword in his hand was wrapped in purple-black flames as he slashed forward. The low roar instantly scattered the thick curtain of rain, as if the space in front of him was also torn open. The 2 armored men opposite him were not afraid. One of them held a spear, and the other held a hammer. They met the attack head-on. Boom! In an instant, countless shockwaves exploded in the wilderness. It was as if a boulder had been thrown into a pool of water. The ripples in the air had turned into waves. In an instant, more than half of the cavalry who were patrolling around the area were knocked off their horses. Ha! While laughing wildly, Lucien suddenly let go of the broadsword in his hand. Taking advantage of the fact that the 2 armored men had not yet recovered from the stiff state caused by the previous blow, Lucien's body moved like a nimble fish to their side. Clang! Clang! Lucien's fingers were like hooks, grabbing one of the arms of the 2 armored men tightly. He used so much strength that the armor was deformed. Taking advantage of the forward momentum, the madness on Lucien's face became more and more intense as he roared. Crack! Both arms were cut off by Lucien. Blood sprayed all over Lucien's body. At this time he seemed to have completely fallen into madness. His whole body was bathed in blood, and he roared at the sky like a demon crawling out of hell. Lucien immediately turned back and roared, "Die all of you!" Who at this moment, a whistling sound suddenly came from the sky. A silver light with the power of wind and thunder descended from the sky. However, Lucien seemed to have expected the enemy above him. He stopped abruptly, turned around, and laughed wildly at Colin, who was descending from the sky. "You're finally here." Before his voice died away, one of his arms grabbed Colin's long sword like a dragon coming out of the sea. Gee! Blood splattered everywhere. The fingers of Lucien's right hand were almost cut off, but he did not even blink. His other hand reached out again and grabbed Colin's ankle. Colin was shocked. His huge bat wings rolled up turbulent air waves, and he tried to rise into the sky again. However, Lucien's feet seemed to be rooted to the ground. No matter how hard Colin struggled, he still did not move. "You, who are you?" A trace of doubt flashed in Lucien's eyes. Then he remembered a rumor he had heard. "Are you the Winged Knight?" Colin did not respond. Seeing that his opponent's face was shrouded in a cloud of blood, Lucien's curiosity grew. He laughed and roared, "Let me see your true face." Before he could finish his sentence, a wave of air suddenly erupted from beneath his feet, and the ground caved in from the pressure. Borrowing the force of the recoil, he leaped into the air and wrapped himself around Colin, who was in midair. Colin flapped his bat wings and made a sharp turn in the air. Unfortunately, he could not get rid of Lucien. He only made him lose his balance temporarily. Taking advantage of this rare opportunity, Colin let go of the long sword in his hand and took out the golden dagger that symbolized the authority of the guardian of the northern frontier. He stabbed at Lucien's chest. Chi. The dagger pierced into Lucien's chest, but he did not make any movement to block it. However, there was still a maniacal smile on his face. He roared, "Let's die together." Bang! One of Lucien's hands also pierced into Colin's chest as fast as lightning, grabbing the heart that was still beating. Colin cried out in pain. It was as if he had been infected by the other party's madness. His entire aura became extremely tragic. "As I said, if you can't kill me." Colin laughed wildly. "I'll make you wish you were dead." Before his voice died away, Colin opened his bloody mouth. His two fangs were shining coldly and pierced into Lucien's neck. The enormous bat wings quickly closed and embraced the two of them. "It's really you." Lucien judged Colin's identity from his words. Before he could figure out how Colin grew a pair of wings, he found that all the blood in his body was crazily flowing into Colin's mouth. It was not only his blood that was flowing away rapidly, but also his strength, temperature, and even consciousness. "Let's die together." Before the darkness enveloped him, Lucien's hands tightened. Bang! Colin's heart was crushed instantly. Boom! Thunder rolled across the sky, but the wilderness suddenly quieted down. The group of blood thralls formed a large circle. In the center of the circle was Colin and Lucien, who were in strange positions. The torrential rain poured down, but it could not wash away the smell of blood that permeated the air. After a long time, Colin stood up from Lucien's body. Then Lucien also got up from the ground and half-knelt in front of Colin. The hatred and madness on his face had completely disappeared, replaced by mechanical obedience and deference. "Master." Colin looked at Lucien kneeling in front of him and couldn't help but smile proudly. Colin's blood shadow guards had suffered heavy losses in this hunt for Lucien. Looking around, almost everyone was injured. A rough count showed that in order to ambush Lucien, a total of 28 blood thralls had died. Even the 2 rank 5 blood thralls were heavily injured. Even Colin's own heart had been crushed. Fortunately, this didn't affect him much. Colin looked at the hole in his chest and touched the edge of the wound, as if nothing had happened. However, although the losses were heavy, the gains were also huge. A rank 6 blood thrall. In this way, the peak strength of the blood shadow guards would be improved qualitatively. With Lucien around, Colin would no longer have to worry about his own safety in this world as long as he did not provoke the other sanctuary powerhouses. Even that resurrected Mr. Feng, as long as he hadn't completely healed the injuries of the Holy Knight's body, Colin wouldn't be unable to retaliate with the current blood shadow guards. It was a pity that the blood of a high-level warrior couldn't help Colin advance. It had to be a high-level knight. However, with a rank 6 warrior, Colin was confident that he could capture a rank 6 knight. Once he successfully entered rank 6, in addition to his blood kindred's true form, Colin felt that he could do whatever he wanted under the sanctuary. However, a rank 6 knight was much more difficult to capture than a rank 6 warrior. Moreover, such a high-level knight had to be a noble with a high status. The difficulty of capturing one was on a completely different level compared to Lucien's. Currently, Colin only knew of 2 rank 6 knights, Emperor Reinhardt and the Duke of St. Prospero of the Eastern region. Which one should he capture? Colin rubbed his chin and fell into deep thought. But soon, he couldn't help but laugh and shake his head. He felt that he was biting off more than he could chew. Obviously, these 2 people were not people that he could deal with now. It was better to solve the problem at hand first. Thinking of this, Colin flapped his bat wings and soared into the sky, flying towards Swan City. Chapter 341. Swan City Radiance Church. In the spacious prayer hall, Archbishop Ajani was leading the believers in prayer according to the requirements of the ceremony. Today was Sunday, and according to the customs of the church, all believers were required to perform morning prayers on this day. Of course, no matter how big the prayer hall was, it could not accommodate all the residents of Swan City. Those who could stand in the hall were basically the nobles of Swan City. As for the commoners, they could only squeeze in the square outside the church, on the streets, and even in front of their houses. As the prayer deepened, the white crystal scepter in Ajani's hand gradually glowed with platinum holy light, reflecting the radiance of the morning sun. It filled the entire prayer hall and continued to spread, coating the entire Swan City with a layer of holy light. At this moment, Swan City showed its most sacred side. Under the illumination of such a divine miracle, hundreds of thousands of believers knelt on one knee, their hands clasped together as they praised the Almighty Lord of Radiance in unison. Praise the Lord! May your light last forever and illuminate the way forward for us. After the ceremony, everyone stood up under Archbishop Ajani's lead. They collected their emotions and began a new day. The nobles in the prayer hall left one after another. Only Count Schultz was left behind by Archbishop Ajani. Count, is Viscount Angley not back yet? Count Schultz shook his head. Not yet. I've already sent someone to look for him. I believe he'll be back soon. No need to look for him. I'm already back. As soon as he finished speaking, Colin strode into the prayer hall and said with a smile, I'm sorry, Your Excellency. I came back late and didn't make it in time for Sunday morning prayers. Ajani smiled, indicating that he did not need to worry. She then asked curiously, Did you catch him? Colin shrugged and said helplessly, Sigh, we still let him escape. Ajani nodded doubtfully. If a grade 6 warrior wants to escape, it's hard to stop him. But you don't need to worry. I've already reported this to Imperial Dragon City. His Holiness the Pope will send holy knights to capture him. Colin nodded. He did not want to talk too much about this and prepared to leave. Seeing this, Akani tried to persuade him to stay. Viscount Angley, can you stay for a while? Hearing this, Colin suppressed the doubts in his heart and nodded. Okay. Seeing this, Count Schultz bowed and said, Lord Guardian, Your Excellency, I'll take my leave first. All right. Looking at Count Schultz's departing figure, Akani suddenly smiled and said, Sir Viscounts, Count Schultz's attitude towards you is really respectful. Colin said calmly, I'm now the guardian of the northern frontier personally conferred by His Majesty. Isn't her attitude natural? Akani looked at Colin with a meaningful gaze. So that's how it is. I thought it was because of the bloody cavalry 50 kilometers north of Swan City. Colin's pupils shrank slightly, and he asked in surprise, You even know this? Akani blinked her eyes and said in a playful tone, Yes, a pious bird told me. That was right. When Colin realized that Count Schultz might be up to no good, he had already informed the bloody cavalry to come to Swan City. According to Colin's plan, if Count Schultz, who had been turned into a blood descendant, could not stand his ground under the pressure of Lucian, and chose to betray him, then Colin would activate Plan B and ask the bloody cavalry to take care of everything. Fortunately, Count Schultz did not let Colin down. In this case, Colin did not have to be so cruel as to wipe out Swan Castle. However, he did not expect that Akani would know about the bloody cavalry hiding outside the city. Of course, Colin did not believe that a pious bird had revealed the traces of the bloody cavalry. It must have been the believers who reported to the church. To be honest, Colin had always admired and envied the church's intelligence ability. Of course, he was also afraid of it. However, this also made Colin realize a problem. Did Count Schultz also know the whereabouts of the bloody cavalry in advance? If she also knew, the reason why she did not betray Colin was because she was a blood descendant, or because she knew that the bloody cavalry was nearby. Once she betrayed Colin, what awaited the Schultz family would only be destruction. When Colin was lost in his thoughts, Akani's voice sounded again. Your Excellency, what are you thinking about? Nothing. Colin answered casually, and then asked, You asked me to stay just now. Is there anything I can help you with? Please follow me. Akane smiled mysteriously and walked past Colin, heading straight outside. Colin was curious and followed her step by step. The two walked out of the prayer hall and went down the spiral stairs. Finally, they came to a dim corridor. On both sides of the corridor, there were fully armored guards every few steps. When they saw Akane, they all bowed their heads to greet her. After walking for about half an hour, a steel gate appeared in front of them. The guard in front of the gate saluted to Akane, and then pushed the gate open. "Viscount Angley, please." Akane made a gesture to let Colin go first. Colin smiled and strode forward. The space inside the gate was more spacious than Colin had imagined, but it was a bit too empty. Except for the statue of the god of light in the center, and the small pool in front of the statue, there was nothing else. He could not help but wonder why such a large space was dug out just to put these two things. Looking around, Colin did not see any light source, but the whole space was full of holy light, and there was no place for darkness to hide. Bang! After Akane came in, the iron gate was closed again. Colin turned around and asked, "Where is this place?" Akane did not answer. Her eyes were a bit blurred, as if she did not hear Colin's question. She just walked slowly toward the statue. Colin furrowed his brows and followed him. Before the statue of the god of light, Akane devoutly prostrated herself on the ground and silently prayed. Colin had no choice but to kneel on one knee before the statue, but he could not help but look at the pool in front of the statue from the corner of his eye. The pool was not big, about 3 meters in diameter, and the water inside was very shallow. But he was surprised to find that the water in the pool was not ordinary water, but more like holy water. Gulp! Colin could not help but swallow his saliva. After a while, Akane ended her prayer and stood up again. Colin immediately asked, "Is this holy water?" Akane stared at the faceless statue of the god of light, and without turning her head, she said, "No." Colin was a little disappointed and asked again, "Then what is this?" Ajani finally turned around. Her gaze was filled with an indescribable meaning as she said softly, "This is the accumulated power of faith." Power of faith? This was the first time Colin had learned that faith could be materialized. Yes, the gods use their mighty powers to protect humans, and humans use their faith to serve the gods. When everyone prays to the god, they will produce the power of faith, and this power of faith will be collected by the radiance churches of the various dioceses, gathering in a space similar to the one we are in. Colin rubbed his chin, staring at the swaying surface of the pool, and asked, "Then what is the use of this power of faith?" Akane shook her head and said, "The cultivation of priests requires the power of faith, but we only need a very small portion of it. Most of the power of faith is needed by the god." Colin nodded thoughtfully and asked again, "This should be a secret of the church. Why are you telling me this?" Akane did not answer this question, but said to herself, "Do you know? The power of faith gathers in this space, liquefies in the holy pool, and is then absorbed by the god through the statue." So, Colin was a little confused. Akane pointed to the pool in front of her, and asked in a low voice, "Look, the water in this pool, has it been absorbed?" Colin narrowed his eyes and looked for a long time, and found that the water in the pool did not decrease, but instead kept increasing. Because it was Sunday, and Archbishop Akane had just personally led the morning prayers, the power of faith surged in and quickly filled the pool. And then, it overflowed. What will happen if it overflows? The liquefied power of faith will disappear after leaving the holy pool. Sure enough, Colin saw that the water disappeared after overflowing. This time he also realized that something was wrong. Since the god of light needed the power of faith, why would he let it overflow without collecting it? Is there a problem with this statue? Colin guessed. Akane shook her head and said in a low voice, "The holy pools under all the radiance churches in the northern frontier are like this. Even the holy pool under the Holy Light Church in Imperial Dragon City is the same. The power of faith is not collected, but overflows the holy pool, and is wasted." Colin narrowed his eyes, and asked with a serious expression, "I still want to know, why are you showing me this?" If the things that Akane had exposed to Colin were to be leaked, It would definitely cause a crisis of faith. The god of light had stopped receiving offerings from humans. What did this mean? Akane still did not answer this question, but asked in return, "Do you know why the Dark Emperor was killed 300 years ago?" Colin's heart skipped a beat, and he said, "Could it be that he discovered this secret?" "Yes." Ajani nodded. However, what truly sounded the Dark Emperor's death knell was something he once said. What did he say? He said. The expression on Akane's face suddenly became extremely complicated. The god is dead. Chapter 342. The god is dead? Colin's eyes widened, and his heart was in turmoil. He knew what this meant in this extraordinary world, and finally understood why the Dark Emperor had to die. Even after his death, all records of him were deliberately destroyed. It was as if someone was desperately trying to completely erase his existence from history. It turned out that it was because of such a rebellious statement. If the Church allowed the Dark Emperor's words to spread widely in the Empire of Light, it would be a huge blow to the belief system of humans. So the judge, Duke Saint Theon, appeared. Colin's right hand could not help but touch the blade of judgment at his waist, and his heart was filled with mixed feelings. The history that had puzzled him back then had finally been unveiled. Then is the god of light really dead? Colin could not help but ask. Ajani shook her head and said, "I don't know. No one knows." What she said was true. How could mortals guess the life and death of a god? It was just that the god of light did not collect the power of faith. This did not mean that the god of light was really dead. Maybe he did not need the power of faith anymore. Of course, this guess was more likely to cause panic. The god of light's protection of humans was actually exchanged by humans using the power of faith to serve him. If he did not need the power of faith, did that mean that he did not need humans anymore, and did not protect them anymore? No matter what, once the believers knew the secret below the church, the foundation of the Church of Light's existence would be shaky. There should be many people who know this secret, right? Colin asked again. Yes. High-ranking priests who are bishops and above all know this secret. In addition, the core members of the 5 Paladin families also know. The Paladin families know this secret because of the Dark Emperor, right? Yes. Ajani nodded. And the reason why he was killed was because he gathered the 5 dukes to make this secret public. Colin sighed, and felt that the Dark Emperor's death was not unjust. This kind of action was not only destroying the foundation of the church, but also harming the fundamental interests of the nobles. It must be known that the Radiance Church and the nobles of the Empire were interdependent. Although they were currently fighting fiercely for power, both sides had a tacit understanding to control the intensity of the struggle within a certain range. They wouldn't really go to the point of no return. After all, if the church really collapsed, who would baptize the nobles? Without receiving baptism, how could a knight be born? Without knights, what right did the nobles have to rule the empire? How could they fight against the alien races that were eyeing them covetously from all directions? Therefore, even if the nobles knew about this secret, they would never reveal it to the public. Therefore, even if the royal family had already fallen out with the church, they would never use such a method that would hurt both sides. Other than the Dark Emperor, who had no idea what he was thinking. So you're telling me this secret now because I've become a core member of the House of St. Hilda in your eyes? Ajani nodded, confirming Colin's judgment. The core members of the 5 great Paladin clans all know of this secret. I will also inform Lord Dukes of the North. However, she immediately changed the topic and said, "However, there's another reason why I'm telling you this secret." Colin's eyes narrowed. He knew that this should be the true reason why Ajani had asked him to come here. What's the reason? Ajani's eyes wandered, her whole body exuding a holy radiance. However, the words she said were blasphemous. I want to reveal this secret to the public. What? Colin thought that he had heard wrongly and looked at Ajani in astonishment. Ajani's eyes were firm as she repeated her words. Are you crazy? Colin could not help but exclaim. Of course, Colin's shock was not due to his devout faith and reverence towards the God of Light, but because he could not understand Ajani's motive. As the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier, the Church of Light was Ajani's foundation. Revealing this secret to the public would lead to a crisis of faith. What good would it do her? Not to mention that doing so would definitely lead to a fatal disaster. The last person who wanted to do this was the emperor of the empire, but he still ended up in a miserable state. Did Ajani think that she would be spared? If she dared to do so, she would definitely become the enemy of the entire empire of light. Whether it was the church or the nobles, they would all want to kill her at all costs. Why do you want to do this? Colin asked in a low voice. Because the believers of our Lord have the right to know this truth, Ajani said calmly, giving a reason that Colin did not know how to evaluate. Seeing Colin's doubtful face, Ajani's expression did not change as she explained. No matter the reason why our Lord no longer collects the power of faith, the church and the nobles have no right to hide this truth. However, faith should not be built on deception. I understand that they are all worried that this truth will cause panic, and even a crisis of faith. However, if some people's faith is shaken because of this, then they are not worthy of being believers of our Lord. Moreover, isn't this a test that our Lord has for us? If this is really the case, then our current response will most likely disappoint him greatly. Hearing Ajani's righteous explanation, Colin did not know what to say for a moment. He did not know if this archbishop of the northern frontier was truly so devout that she could not tolerate her faith being blasphemed, or if she was just looking for a high-sounding excuse to conceal her true ulterior motives. Colin narrowed his eyes, and his tone became somewhat cold. Then, Your Eminence, why do you think that I will support your idea? As a believer of our Lord, a knight of the northern frontier, and a viscount of the empire, I should stop you from doing such a foolish thing, right? Because I believe in the guidance of the holy light. Ajani stared into Colin's eyes and gave him an answer that left him speechless. The guidance of the holy light? Yes, your affinity with the holy light is something I have never seen before. I believe that this is the guidance of our Lord. A devout knight like you will definitely not tolerate the church continuing to deceive our Lord's believers. Colin fell silent. He remembered that Ajani had indeed said such words back in Coldwinter City. Furthermore, Pope Gregory had also said similar words to Colin back in Imperial Dragon City. Could it be that he was really the chosen one? Of course, such an illusory thing was obviously unable to convince Colin. Sometimes, a white lie is more precious than the cruel truth, Colin said expressionlessly. He did not want to become an ally of this crazy archbishop of the northern frontier. In Colin's opinion, what she wanted to do was practically courting death. Good intentions? A cold smile appeared on Ajani's pretty face. So, tampering with the Duke's baptism ceremony was also out of good intentions? Colin's pupils shrank, but he was not too surprised. Ajani had said that she had met Vera on the way to Swan City. With her insight as an archbishop, it was not surprising that she could see that the Pope had tampered with Vera's baptism. Ajani saw the change in Colin's expression and was delighted. She hurriedly continued to agitate him. Actually, the upper echelons of the church have long been corrupted. They have long forgotten their original intentions and mission. Although many people are desperately trying to slander the Dark Emperor and find ways to erase his traces, in reality, they have already been influenced by his arrogant words. They vaguely feel that the God of Light is really no longer around, or at least has cut off all contact with this world. When there are no longer any scrutinizing eyes above their heads, they have also begun to become unscrupulous. The original pure faith has long been corrupted and tarnished. Fighting for power and profit has become their only goal and pursuit. They keep saying that it is for the God of Light, but in reality, it is only for their own interests and status. Viscount Angley, do you think that such a church is really suitable to continue to dominate the spiritual world of mankind? Colin stared into Ajani's eyes. For some reason, he suddenly thought of another woman, Queen Medela. Chapter 343. Colin Lin suddenly thought of something. Could this Archbishop Ajani be related to the royal family? Thus he seemingly inadvertently raised his hands to his chest, palms facing inwards, his fingers intertwined, forming a lotus-like handprint. Then he carefully observed Ajani's reaction. However, Colin was disappointed. After seeing this handprint, Ajani only looked puzzled and did not show any other expression. This handprint was shown to Colin by Queen Medela after her alliance with him. She even said that anyone who saw this handprint could be trusted. But obviously, Ajani was not an ally of the royal family. Colin immediately withdrew his handprint and crossed his arms in front of his chest. He smiled and said, "I think you should go to the royal family. They are more interested in the Pope's dark secrets." Ajani shook her head and said, "Sir Viscounts, you are wrong. The royal family is well aware of the church's depravity and is also willing to fight against the church. However, they will never agree to this truth being made public. If I go to them, I will only end up like the Dark Emperor." "Sorry, Archbishop. I do not want to end up like the Dark Emperor." Colin shrugged and rejected. "With just the two of us, even if this truth is made public, we will not be able to escape the pursuit of the church and the Holy Knight family. We will also be slandered as lunatics and blasphemers. No one will believe our words. Sir Viscounts, I am not a stupid person. Before I have enough power, of course I will not make this truth public. The reason why I chose you as my partner is because you are not a member of the Holy Knight family, but you have the potential to dominate a territory. Sir Archbishop, you think too highly of me." Colin's expression was still indifferent. "No." Ajani's eyes flashed with an inexplicable brilliance, and her tone carried a hint of bewitchment. "You are now the guardian of the northern frontier, and I know that the half-elven kingdom is also under your control. In the future, even if you lead your troops to the east and defeat the Pegasus army, it is not impossible for you to enter the White Dew City. However, have you thought of a problem? Even if one day you really conquer the eastern region, can the Angeli family become a duke?" Colin's heart skipped a beat. He seemed to understand what Akani wanted to say. "Your Excellency Viscounts, the position of duke has never been granted to anyone who isn't a holy knight, no matter what kind of dazzling achievements he had made in the past. I know your talent is amazing, and you're already a 5th grade knight at such a young age, but do you think you can become a holy knight?" Colin did not answer. However, he felt that if he could drink the blood of a holy knight, he might be able to step into the sanctuary realm. "It's not that I want to put you down, but in the Empire's 1,000+ years of history, there has never been anyone who isn't from a holy knight family who has stepped foot into the Saint Domain. I don't know what kind of secrets there are. However, I feel that no matter how talented you are, I'm afraid you won't be able to break through this shackle. So, even if you become a 6th grade knight, what's the difference between you and the 6th grade warrior Lucian? He's attached to Count Schultz, and you can't leave the house of St. Hilda either. Even if you conquer the eastern region one day, the Angeli family will never become the lord of the eastern region." Colin narrowed his eyes and asked in a deep voice, "What are you trying to say?" Akani walked a few steps closer and stared into Colin's eyes. She said seriously, "You've been asking me why I chose you as my partner, haven't you? This is the real reason. Because you're not from a holy knight family. The only people who don't want to see this belief system, which is based on deception, collapse is actually the church and the holy knight family. That's why they work together to hide the truth, to prevent a crisis of faith from happening. However, as a descendant of a holy knight family, Viscount Angli, even if a crisis of faith happens, and the belief system of the Church of Light collapses, is it really a bad thing for you? Without the power of faith, there would be no priests. Without priests, there would be no new knights, and naturally, there would be no more holy knights. Without holy knights, how can the royal family and the 4 great families stand at the top of the empire? Why can't the Angeli family become a duke? Even." Akani suddenly stopped talking, but Colin completely understood what she meant. At the same time, he saw the true face hidden under Akani's pious appearance. That face was filled with something called ambition. Moreover, he was also frightened by Akani's madness. This woman looked holy, quiet, and compassionate, but in reality, she was a crazy ambitious woman who wanted nothing more than to throw the world into chaos. Seeing Colin's silence, Akani thought he was moved, but still couldn't make up his mind. She opened her mouth again to tempt him. "Your Excellency Viscounts, now that the royal family and the church are at war, it's our best chance. During this trip to Imperial Dragon City, I'm sure Emperor Reinhardt must have encouraged you to march into the eastern region? To tell you the truth, His Holiness the Pope has told me many times to stop the army of the North from successfully taking down White Dew City. However, if you cooperate with me, I can help you block all the pressure from the church, and promise you a stable rear. This way, you can also march into the eastern region without any distractions. As long as we conquer the eastern region, we will have 2 territories in our hands, and have the capital to not fear the church and the royal family. Colin sneered and said, Your Excellency Archbishop, have you forgotten that the Empire still has 2 holy knights? Will they sit and watch us shake the foundation of the entire knight system? Akani said confidently, Your Excellency Viscounts, have you forgotten that the eastern region also has a force that can resist the holy knights? Yevel? Colin's face changed and he suddenly realized something, and immediately said, So you are with Mr. Yevel? Akani suddenly smiled. Her beautiful face was like a peach blossom in full bloom. Your Excellency Viscounts, do you have confidence in our plan now? Obviously, Akani had tacitly agreed with Colin's guess. Colin lowered his head, various thoughts running through his mind. He did not expect that the haunting Mr. Yevel had already quietly extended his hand into the church, and had even bribed a high-ranking person like the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier. No wonder he dared to kidnap the Archbishop of Swan City, and even brazenly kill him, and was not afraid of the church's revenge. Akani would definitely cover for him, and help him get through the weakest period. And now they had actually set their sights on Colin, and wanted to rope in the actual controller of the Northern Frontier. It had to be said that Colin was somewhat moved. He suddenly realized that this was indeed a good opportunity. Originally, Colin was caught between the royal family and the church. Both sides were trying to rope him in, but both wanted him to be a sharp sword in their hands. Now that a third party was added to the mix, Colin's options were greater. The space for him to maneuver was also wider. At the very least, if Akani and Colin reached a secret agreement, he would not have to worry about the church causing trouble on the northern frontier when he was advancing into the eastern region, and dragging him down. Of course, Colin was still very wary of Mr. G and Ajani. The 2 of them were not good people. They had taken a fancy to Colin only because they wanted him to be their tool. May I ask if I can meet Mr. Yevel? Colin probed. Akani was somewhat hesitant, but still nodded. I will convey your intentions to Mr. Yevel, but you must know that Prince Lacey is currently at the northern frontier, and is pursuing him relentlessly. It is not convenient for Mr. Yevel to show himself, so I may not be able to arrange a meeting with you in the near future. I understand. Colin smiled faintly, but did not say much. He knew that he had not really gained the other party's trust. By the way, can you help to remove the divine spell that Vera is under? Akani shook her head. I am sorry, Your Excellency Viscounts, that is a divine spell cast by the Pope himself, and only he can remove it. But you don't have to worry. With me at the northern frontier, the church will not be a hindrance to you. I will also not use the Duke to cause trouble for you. That's good. Colin nodded. In fact, this was the biggest reason why he was willing to cooperate with Akani. As for how their relationship would develop in the future, and whether or not they would fall out, that would have to wait until the future. Colin was confident that by that time, he would have the confidence to confront the other party directly. I look forward to working with you. Akani stretched out her small white hand and smiled. Colin also shook the other party's hand and smiled brightly. I look forward to working with you. Chapter 344. Leaving the Radiance Church, Colin strolled back to Swan Castle alone. He learned from the butler that Count Schultz had just gone out to inspect the territory. Colin did not mind. The Countess had just experienced Lucien's rebellion, and she needed to quickly pacify the people and deal with the remnants of Lucien's forces. After losing Lucien, the Schultz family could only rely on Colin if they wanted to maintain their status in the northern frontier. He believed that the rest of the Schultz family would also understand this and make the right choice. When night fell, Colin finished his dinner, and was about to take a bath with the help of the maids. The butler came to report that Count Schultz had returned to Swan Castle. Got it. I'll go see the Count after my bath. Colin submerged his body in the hot water of a suitable temperature, admiring the various exquisite decorations in the bathroom, as he recalled what Archbishop Ajani had told him during the day. He had to admit that Colin really admired Mr. Mao from the House of St. Thean. It seemed that Mr. Mao could surprise him every time. Of course, it could also be a shock. Colin was very curious about how Mr. Mao had persuaded Ajani to rebel. As the youngest Archbishop of the Radiance Empire, and highly regarded by the Pope, Ajani could be said to have a bright future. It was almost certain that she would become a cardinal in the future. She could even become the first female pope in the history of the Radiance Empire. So, how did Mr. Mao persuade Ajani to give up such a bright future and choose an extremely dangerous path of rebellion? Colin could not figure it out. However, Colin did not have a bad impression of Mr. Mao. Although they had always been on opposite sides, Mr. Mao had not caused any substantial damage to Colin. Of course, this was also because Colin had never been Mr. Mao's main target. After all, Colin was just a small figure before, and was not worthy of Mr. Mao's special attention. Now that he had become the guardian of the northern frontier, Colin was qualified to be targeted. However, he did not expect Mr. Chong to choose to rope him in. Colin could also guess that the reason the other party deliberately left Bishop John's body in the basement of Swan Castle was to use the Schultz family to get rid of Colin. However, he did not expect that Colin would expel Lucien from Swan City and successfully control Count Schultz. In addition, Mr. Chong should be at his weakest right now. Seeing that Colin was not a simple character that was easy to deal with, he had no choice but to change his strategy and rope him in. Of course, Colin was also extremely wary of Mr. Fong. He knew that if Mr. Fong successfully survived this period of weakness, there would be a question mark as to whether he could continue to tolerate the northern frontier being controlled by Colin. Therefore, Colin knew that he had to seize the time when Mr. Chong was recovering and work hard to strengthen his own power and influence. In this way, no matter how the future of the Empire of Light changed, Colin would have the ability to protect himself. While thinking, Colin heard light footsteps approaching. He did not pay much attention, thinking that it was a maid who came to add water. But then, a snow-white and delicate foot reached into the water, followed by a white and slender leg. Under Colin's surprised gaze, the naked Count Schultz had already sat down beside him. The Countess's body was impeccable. Her soft skin had a pearl-like luster, and above her plump buttocks was a slender waist. Further up, there were two bright red dots that made Colin's blood boil. "Master, let me serve you in the bath," Count Schultz whispered in Colin's ear, with a seductive smile on his face. Colin was intoxicated by the fragrant scent, and his slightly stiff body gradually relaxed. Waves suddenly appeared on the originally calm water surface. The first rays of the morning sun shone on the mirror-like surface of Swan Lake. Thousands of rays of light that looked like fragmented rainbows were projected on the mirror-like surface of the lake. Colin stood on the balcony of the highest floor of Swan Castle, looking at the beautiful scenery in front of him that was somewhat unreal. He felt unprecedentedly satisfied. He took a deep breath, and his nose was filled with dew and the fragrance of flowers and plants. Suddenly, a series of familiar footsteps came from behind him. Colin turned around and saw Count Schultz walking over with enchanting steps. After a night, the Countess, who was already beautiful, looked even more gorgeous. She was only wearing a thin silk dress with a low-cut, corset, and backless design that vividly showed off her beautiful body curves and lustrous and smooth skin. As she walked, two snow-white and slender legs were faintly discernible under the open-necked dress, like a blooming iris flower. "Good morning, master." Count Schultz's charming smile made Colin's heart skip a beat. He touched the tip of his nose and smiled. "You can still call me by my old name." "Yes, Sir Viscounts." Count Schultz changed the way he addressed Lucien, but his attitude did not change at all. After a night of deep communication, Colin also knew that Countess Schultz was actually a woman who did not have many opinions of her own. Her weak personality was actually not suitable to be a lord. That was why she chose to marry Lucien, and now she did not hesitate to rely on Colin. However, such a personality was indeed more convenient for Colin to control. The ambiguous past between you and Marquis Garcia was also made up to pretend to be Vera's birth mother, right? Yes. Countess Schultz's white cheeks blushed. However, the Duke of St. Hilda did want to set me up with Marquis Garcia, but Marquis Garcia did not want to give up the command of the Black Cavalry, and Marquis Garcia's importance in the northern frontier, so the Duke of St. Hilda gave up. Then why did you betray the Duke of St. Hilda in Ice Stone City? Actually, I had no choice at that time. Among the 200,000 soldiers that Marquis Charles sacrificed, there was one of the most elite soldiers of the Schultz family. After learning about this, the family complained about it. I was also very dissatisfied with the Duke of St. Hilda, so I followed the lords of the northern frontier to force the Duke to give us an explanation. Colin nodded and asked, "How many soldiers does the Schultz family have now?" Countess Schultz tucked her hair behind her ear and said, "We should be able to gather 60 to 70,000 soldiers." Good. Reorganize this army. I may need to conscript them at any time. Yes. I will return to Coldwinter City tomorrow. If you need any help, let me know as soon as possible. You are leaving so soon? Countess Schultz asked in surprise. Her beautiful face was full of reluctance. Yes. Colin reached out and pulled the Countess into his arms. He wrapped his arms around her supple waist and said gently, "I can't relax now. I have to race against time." "Why are you in such a hurry?" Colin smelled the fragrance of Countess Schultz's hair and said vaguely, "I have a feeling that there will be a great change in the Empire. Therefore, I have to prepare in advance." "Great change?" Countess Schultz's voice tightened. "You don't have to panic. Just do as I say." "Yes. Also, you have to be careful of Archbishop Ajani. Don't believe her words so easily. Also, if that Duke of St. Hilda appears in Swan City again, send me a message immediately. Okay." After giving these instructions, Colin reached out and grabbed Countess Schultz's smooth chin. He lowered his head and kissed her. Since they were about to leave, they had to bid farewell properly. Chapter 345. It was dawn. The rising sun shone gently through the dense clouds, and the mist surging like waves shrouded the mountains and the wilderness. A caravan of merchants was treading on the morning dew, traveling along a small path in the forest. At the front of the caravan, a flag embroidered with tulips fluttered in the wind. After passing through a bumpy path, the axles of the carriage creaked under the jolts. The curtains of the carriage were suddenly lifted, revealing a round, chubby face. "Lord Oliver, what are your orders?" A mercenary standing guard beside the carriage asked with a smile. Oliver looked carefully at the winding path in front of him and asked with a frown, "Why did you choose this path?" "My lord, although this path is slightly more difficult to traverse, it's shorter. We'll reach Swan City in about 3 days." Oliver did not seem to be worried. He asked, "Where's your captain?" "He's right in front." The mercenary was just speaking when he saw a figure walking quickly towards him. He immediately said, "My lord, the captain is just coming over." Oliver turned his head and saw that the bearded Captain Jack had already arrived at the side of the carriage. The captain's brows were tightly knitted together, and he looked very worried. "Lord Oliver, I've just received news that something has happened in Swan City." "What?" Oliver's heart skipped a beat, and his expression changed instantly. He hurriedly asked, "What happened?" "I heard that Count Schultz's husband, Lord Lucian, murdered Bishop John, and is now being pursued by the army." "How could this be? Why would Lucian murder Bishop John?" "I don't know." "Then can we still enter Swan City?" "We should be able to. Swan City is not locked down. However, I advise you to reconsider. After all, Swan City is not peaceful now." Oliver's brows were tightly knitted together, and his chubby face was scrunched up in worry. He was in a dilemma. Seeing this, Captain Jack added, "I also heard that Viscount Angley is currently in Swan City. He was the one who exposed Lucian's crime." "Viscount Angley is also in the city." Oliver suddenly became excited, as if the name had a strange magic power. "Yes." Colonel Jack nodded, then probed, "I heard that you've dealt with the Viscounts before. Is that true?" Oliver immediately puffed out his chest. His face glowed with boundless glory as he boasted loudly. Of course it's true. Back then, before the Viscounts inherited the title, we already knew each other. We even slept in the same tent and went to the battlefield together. Just as Oliver was about to brag about his time with Viscount Angley to the mercenary leader in front of him, the ground suddenly began to tremble slightly. Earthquake? Oliver asked stupidly. However, it didn't take long for the ground to shake more and more violently. Even the grass and leaves were shaking violently. Walala! It was as if spring thunder had exploded the earth, or as if a surging flood had swept over. The shattered sand and stones on the ground danced, as if they had been picked up and put down by an invisible hand. Looking from the sky, it looked like boiling water. It's the cavalry. Colonel Jack pointed to the front with a trembling finger, and his voice changed. Countless black shadows instantly appeared on the horizon in front of him, filling up the space between heaven and earth. The densely packed cavalry surged forward like a tornado, crushing the rocks and withered grass on the ground into smithereens. Oliver and his party seemed to be dumbfounded. They were stunned and shivering in place. They were completely at a loss. It was impossible to run away. They could only silently pray in their hearts that this terrifying cavalry was not the enemy. It's the blood cavalry. Not knowing who saw the blood-colored flag fluttering in the wind, someone immediately shouted. Oliver's eyes lit up when he heard that. He scrambled out of the carriage and looked at the cavalry squad galloping towards them. He shouted at the top of his lungs. We are the Tulip Chamber of Commerce, the Tulip Chamber of Commerce. I know Sir Viscount Angley. Not long after, a blood cavalry squad came to the front of Oliver. The leading officer was sitting high on the warhorse. His sharp eyes coldly looked at Oliver through the small holes in the armor. His imposing manner made the whole caravan silent. What's your name? My name is Oliver, the president of the Tulip Chamber of Commerce. Is Viscount Angley in front? The blood cavalry officer nodded and said, Come with me, the Viscount wants to see you. Oliver's spirit was refreshed. He quickly ordered his men to bring a horse to pull the carriage. He moved his fat body and clumsily climbed up. The officer looked at his difficult appearance and became impatient. He stepped forward and grabbed Oliver's collar. In his exclamation, he lifted him on the back of his horse, and then urged the warhorse to go in the direction of the blood cavalry. By the time Oliver arrived in front of Colin, he was almost out of breath from the jolting. Viscount Angley! Ugh! After this fellow dismounted, he vomited all over the ground, and then weakly greeted Colin. Colin looked at the familiar fat face, and asked the attendant to pass him a pot of water. He smiled and asked, Oliver, I heard that you are now the president of the Tulip Chamber of Commerce? Oliver drank the water and finally recovered. He quickly replied, Yes, Sir Viscounts. After the death of Lady Penny, I was chosen by Count Oman to take over the Tulip Chamber of Commerce. The Count Oman that Oliver mentioned was Vala. Of course, this appointment was actually approved by Colin. He had a good impression of the fat merchant. After taking control of the Oman family through Vala, he signaled the other party to push Oliver to the position of president of the Tulip Chamber of Commerce. Later, the obedient and sensible Oliver began to clean up the remaining forces of the Tulip Chamber of Commerce under Vala's instructions. So far, the progress was said to be smooth. You are going to Swan City? Yes, sir. Oliver's small eyes turned and took the opportunity to ask. I heard that the situation in Swan City is a bit chaotic now. I wonder if our trip will. Don't worry. Colin waved his hand and comforted. The Schultz family has stabilized the situation. You will not have any problems going. That's good. Oliver was relieved. He had an inexplicable trust in Colin. Colin looked at the old acquaintance and suddenly asked, I heard that the merchants of the Northern Frontier are preparing to unite and establish a Northern Frontier Merchants Association? Yes, sir. Oliver glanced at Colin's expression and answered carefully. The Tulip Chamber of Commerce is also preparing to join the Northern Frontier Merchants Association. Count Oman knows about this and has agreed. Colin nodded and asked, Who is the president of the Merchants Association? Sir, the president's candidate has not been decided yet. However, We plan to hold a meeting in chilly winter at the end of this month to decide the president's candidate. Colin stroked his chin, not knowing what to think. After a while, he spoke again. Oliver, do you want to be the president of the Northern Frontier Merchants Association? Oliver's fat body trembled, not knowing if it was due to nervousness or excitement. After hesitating for a while, he gave a slippery answer. I will obey your orders. Colin smiled faintly and didn't comment on Oliver's answer. Instead, he changed the topic. Instead, he said, help me spread the news. Tell the merchants and chambers of commerce in the northern frontier that the House of St. Hilda is preparing to borrow money to tide over the current difficulties. The loan amount is huge. Tell the interested merchants to come to chilly winter before the end of the month. Yes. Oliver quickly agreed. However, Colin did not mention the matter of him being the president of the Merchants Association. Oliver was itching but did not dare to take the initiative to ask. Well, go to Swan City by yourself. Remember to meet me at chilly winter at the end of the month. Yes, sir. Later, Colin gently squeezed the horse's belly and joined the main troop of the bloody cavalry in Oliver's worried eyes. They went all the way to the north. Chapter 346. At this time, it was already the end of summer, the weather was gradually cooling down, and the sun was no longer scorching. Colin led the bloody cavalry all the way north, and it only took him 6 days to arrive at Coldwinter City. It was evening, and the majestic Coldwinter City looked more solemn in the sunset. When Colin arrived at the bottom of the city wall, he found that Vera was already standing in front of the suspension bridge, welcoming the man who had returned from afar. She was wearing a purple lady's dress, which set off the beautiful curves of her body, but did not lose her dignity and elegance. The light makeup just right made the original beautiful face more bright and moving. She looked at Colin with her beautiful eyes full of tenderness and sweetness. Colin felt warm in his heart, and he immediately turned over and strode up. Although he wanted to hold the lovely person in front of him in his arms, Colin suppressed this impulse, and according to the proper aristocratic etiquette, he knelt down on one knee to greet his lord. But he did not expect that Vera had already pulled Colin before he knelt down, and said intimately, Colin, welcome home. Colin then no longer cared about the red tape, leaned over and kissed Vera's smooth forehead, and said with a smile, My wife, you are so beautiful today. Vera smiled sweetly, and then took Colin's arm, and walked into the city together. Teacher. Inside the city gate, Prince Harrison and Princess Judy greeted him in a crisp voice. Colin nodded to the two little guys, and then helped Vera into the carriage. Surrounded by a team of guards, the carriage passed through half of the city, and came to the Lion's Roar Castle on the top of the mountain. The servants had already prepared a sumptuous dinner to welcome Colin's return. Walking into the Knight's Hall with Vera, the air was filled with a faint rose fragrance. Marquis Garcia stood in the middle of the hall, wearing a neat noble attire. He nodded at Colin. Compared to a month ago, Marquis Garcia seemed to be in much better spirits, and there was some color on his face. However, his posture was still stooped, and he held a cane in his hand. His eyes were no longer sharp, and it seemed that the all-powerful army god of the northern frontier had completely disappeared. Colin also hurriedly bowed in return, and exchanged a look with the other party, but did not say anything. At this time, Scholar Dwayne, Knight Campbell, and the Bishop Emeritus also saluted Colin. Young Master Joyce was also in the hall, but this young man was not good at hiding his emotions. He nodded at Colin perfunctorily, then looked at the ground with puffed cheeks, as if he was very reluctant to appear here. Of course, Colin would not pay attention to a child who was throwing a tantrum, and he invited everyone to take a seat. For such a formal banquet, everyone's seating was particular. Colin and Vera sat side by side at the head of the table. On the right were Marquis Garcia and the Bishop Emeritus. On the left were Prince Harrison and Princess Judy. Below them were Joyce, Scholar Dwayne, and the Knights of the House of St. Hilda. As Archbishop Agatha was still in Swan City dealing with Bishop John's funeral, the Bishop Emeritus of Coldwinter City represented the church at the banquet. Colin looked around and did not see the former Imperial Minister of Agriculture, whom he had abducted from Winterspring Town. He asked, Why don't I see Scholar Sonny? Scholar Dwayne smiled and said, Scholar Sonny said that he was researching the northern frontier to prepare for the agricultural reform. Therefore, he is not in Coldwinter City now. Colin nodded and thought that Scholar Sonny was really dedicated to his work. He had just arrived and he had already started his research. He ignored him and smiled as he asked Vera to announce the start of the banquet. Vera immediately raised her golden wine glass and said, Everyone, please drink this glass. May the glory of the God of Light bless us, and may the house of Saint Hilda prosper forever. Everyone raised their wine glasses one after another, and responded loudly. Colin drank the champagne in his glass and said with a smile, Everyone, please enjoy the delicious food tonight. Everyone cheered, and began to focus on the food on the table. In this world, it was a very serious matter for the feudal lord to host a banquet. There was a set of very standard etiquette. During the meal, no one was allowed to speak until the main course was served. They had to knock their cutlery on the table to indicate that they were full. Only then could they chat with other people who were full. The whole process was rather boring, and the only fun was to see who ate more. In fact, this was also part of the etiquette. The more one ate, the more satisfied they were with the food prepared by the feudal lord. At the same time, they could also show their strength and bravery. The cooking skills of the House of St. Hilda were of course top-notch. There were grilled crocodile tail, oysters with white mushrooms, steamed salmon, roasted goose liver, cream salad. All kinds of delicious dishes were placed on the huge long table. Amidst the clanging sounds of the expanding knives and forks, everyone tried their best to stuff the food into their stomachs while maintaining their etiquette. The maids were like butterflies flying through flowers. With light footsteps, they kept changing the plates and refilling the wine for everyone. Although Colin did not need these ordinary foods to replenish his energy, he also began to eat when he saw that everyone had a high appetite. The maids behind him had already changed his plate 4 times. Seeing that the maids were about to change his plate for the 5th time, Colin finally knocked on his plate to indicate that he was full. Vera, who was sitting at the side, had already finished eating. She smiled and said, Colin, you have a good appetite today. Yes, after leaving the northern frontier for so long, I still miss the food at home. The Bishop Emeritus also knocked on his plate and put down his knife and fork. He asked, Your Excellency, I heard that Bishop John of Swan City was killed by Lucien? To be precise, Lucien colluded with outsiders to murder him. Next, Colin selectively recounted what had happened in Swan City to everyone. Of course, he did not mention the Duke of St. Hilda, who had come back from the dead. He just used the word mysterious instead. Mr. Chang's reincarnation was too strange and difficult to explain clearly. Moreover, Colin and Mr. Chang had reached a secret agreement, so he didn't want to create unnecessary trouble and cause unnecessary trouble. Even though Colin had already hidden the most strange part, everyone was still shocked. Obviously, they did not expect that the Peak Warrior, the husband of Count Schultz, would do such a thing. May the light of the Lord shine on Bishop John and let his soul rest in peace. After listening to the story, the Bishop Emeritus lowered his head and prayed with a complicated expression. Looking at this scene, everyone also lowered their heads and prayed to express their condolences. Colin looked at the people who were praying with a complicated expression. If they knew that the Lord of Light could no longer hear their prayers and receive their power of faith, would they still be pious? After praying, everyone began to chat. Seeing that everyone had finished their main meal, the butler ordered the maids to serve dessert. Colin and Vera shared all kinds of things they had seen and heard during their trip to Imperial Dragon City, and the atmosphere gradually became relaxed and harmonious. However, Colin noticed that Joyce had been whispering in Princess Judy's ear, making Princess Judy giggle from time to time. This made Colin's expression change slightly. He was very curious. Did Joyce really hit it off with Princess Judy, or was he deliberately trying to get close to the princess under the guidance of someone else? If it was the latter, the candles on the long table gradually burned out, and the banquet came to an end. Vera stood up and announced the end of the banquet. She then held Colin's hand and walked out of the hall. However, Colin stopped at the entrance of the Knight's Hall. After waiting for Marquis Garcia to catch up with him, he smiled at Vera and said, "You can go back first. I want to talk to the Marquis for a while." Okay. Vera smiled gently and then left. Marquis Garcia nodded at Colin and said, "Follow me to the study." Okay. Chapter 347. When Colin walked into the study, he noticed that the layout of the room had completely changed. The tables, chairs, cabinets, floors, and windows were all remade with brand new mahogany, and the entire room was filled with a faint smell of wood. A row of white crystals was inlaid on the white walls. These crystals were a special arcane material that could magnify light. Even without too many candles, the entire room was as bright as day. A huge specimen of a tiger's head was originally hanging above the fireplace. It was said that the previous Duke of St. Hilda had hunted it himself, but now it had disappeared and was replaced by a gorgeous blood rose wreath. The changes in the study seemed to imply that the owner of the castle had changed. Count Schultz is not Vera's biological mother. Fortunately, you did not fall into his trap, Marquis Garcia said. Colin nodded, and then carefully asked, "Then Vera's biological mother is?" Marquis Garcia looked at Colin with a warning look, hesitated for a moment and said, "You don't need to know who she is. You just need to know that she is no longer alive. So no matter who comes forward and claims to be Vera's biological mother, it is all a lie." Colin sighed secretly, and he thought that Queen Medela had indeed lied. My goodness, they are all a bunch of actors. Fortunately, I am also one of them. Then, who knows the true identity of Vera's biological mother? Colin asked again. This was because he realized that Mr. Xing dared to let Count Schultz pretend to be Vera's biological mother, and he was confident that Marquis Garcia would not dare to expose them in public. Obviously, he knew the true identity of Vera's biological mother, and he knew that this identity should not be exposed. The question was, how did Mr. Xing find out? Colin could understand that Queen Medela knew about this matter. After all, they were brother and sister, and it was not surprising that she knew some of her brother's secrets. But Mr. Xing, could it be that when he took over the body of the Duke of St. Hilda, he also obtained his memories? Why do you ask? Marquis Garcia looked at Colin with vigilant eyes. Colin had no choice but to tell him about how Mr. Feng might have possessed the body of the Duke of St. Hilda, and how he had bewitched Count Schultz to impersonate Vera's biological mother. Of course, he did not tell her about the secret agreement he had made with a Johnny in the basement of the church. Marquis Garcia was silent for a long time, his expression constantly changing. In fact, Marquis Garcia knew that the body buried in the family tomb was not the real body of his brother. When Colin had brought him back from the eastern region, he had confessed to him. He could also understand the necessity of using a fake corpse to fool them under the circumstances at that time, so he didn't blame Colin too harshly. He only said that after Vera successfully inherited the dukedom, he would come back to the Morrison family to ask for the corpse of the previous duke. However, he did not expect that the body had already been taken over by Mr. Feng. Moreover, this kind of reincarnation was too incredible. Marquis Garcia found it difficult to accept for a while. After pondering for a long time, Marquis Garcia suddenly said, "You don't have to worry about this matter. I will personally negotiate with the Morrison family." Colin's heart skipped a beat. He immediately realized that the House of St. Hilda and the Morrison family might have some connections that he did not know about. Even the blood pool under the Morrison family's bell tower, could the House of St. Hilda be aware of it? Thinking about it carefully, the House of St. Hilda married so many noble ladies to the Morrison family. Could it be that they had other motives? Thinking that so many innocent young ladies were unknowingly used as some kind of bloody research tool by the two families, Colin could not help but feel a chill in his heart. However, he also knew that this should involve some unspeakable secrets of the House of St. Hilda. Marquis Garcia obviously did not want him to have too much contact with them. In desperation, Colin nodded and then changed the topic. He told Marquis Vera that Pope Gregory had used magic on her when she was baptized. Marquis Garcia listened quietly and fell into silence again. After a long time he asked, "Do you know what was the biggest disagreement between Ceres and me?" Colin was stunned. He then realized that the Ceres that Marquis Garcia mentioned was the name of the previous Duke of St. Hilda. It should be the direction of the development of the northern frontier, right? Colin recalled the various conflicts between the two brothers. The Duke wanted to capture the rich but weak eastern region, while you wanted to destroy the Troll Empire. Yes. Marquis Garcia nodded and his face was full of emotion. At this time last year, when we annihilated the 300,000 troll army in the Sky Ice Field, Ceres could no longer hold back his determination to go to the east. For this reason, he did not hesitate to marry Vera to the half-elf kingdom. He wanted to take control of the key to enter the eastern region, and at the same time, he also wanted to force me to lead the Black Cavalry to the east. Unfortunately, Mr. Syringe's conspiracy completely disrupted Ceres's plan. Colin was silent. He had personally experienced the matter of Vera marrying into the half-elf kingdom. At that time, he was complacent and thought that he had gained a great advantage. In fact, now that he thought about it, he was just an ignorant chess piece that went with the flow on the chessboard. Ceres wanted to enter the eastern region. In addition to coveting the richness of the eastern region, it was also instigated by the royal family. Marquis Garcia glanced at Colin and asked, "This time, when you went to Imperial Dragon City, Emperor Reinhardt and Empress Medela should have also tried to win you over, right?" Colin nodded and said, "Yes, they really want me to enter the eastern region and cut off the church's biggest support in the secular world." Marquis Garcia stared at Colin's eyes and asked, "What do you think?" Colin looked at Marquis Garcia's serious expression and changed his words. "I think that humans should not kill each other. This will give the other races an opportunity to take advantage of." Marquis Garcia's face showed a gratified smile as he nodded and said, "It's good that you understand. As a knight, the most important character is loyalty. I remember that when we were in Icestone City, I once asked you, what is loyalty?" Colin nodded and couldn't help but touch the blade of judgment at his waist. Scenes of the past gradually floated into his mind. Marquis Garcia continued, "Loyalty doesn't mean being loyal to a person, because people's hearts are unpredictable and easy to change. The only thing that is truly worthy of your unlimited loyalty is a certain belief." Belief. Colin mulled over Marquis Garcia's words, and seemed to understand something in his heart. A knight's belief is to protect. Marquis Garcia's expression became incomparably sincere. "What I have done in my life is to protect the human race. This is my belief. No matter what happens, no matter where I am, I will always be loyal to it." At this point, Marquis Garcia heavily patted Colin's shoulder and said seriously, "I hope that you can also find a belief that is worthy of your unlimited loyalty. Only in this way will you not be trapped in the endless struggle for power and profit, and lose yourself in the endless struggle for power and profit." Colin looked at Marquis Garcia's pure and fearless eyes, and felt the weight on his shoulder. He suddenly understood why this Marquis had spent the first half of his life in the most difficult front lines of the northern frontier, and saw the trolls as his lifelong enemy. So the enmity between him and his brother was because of this. Perhaps, this was a true knight. This was the guardian of the human race. For a moment, Marquis Garcia's stooped figure became tall and big in Colin's eyes. "I understand," Colin said seriously. Marquis Garcia smiled faintly and said, "I have always thought highly of you. Don't disappoint me." After saying this, he turned and walked out of the door. Colin suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Marquis, I am going to implement Scholar Sunny's agricultural reform plan in the northern frontier. In addition, I am also going to borrow." Marquis Garcia waved his hand without looking back and interrupted, "You don't need to tell me about these government affairs. You can do it as you see fit. After all, you are now the guardian of the northern frontier and Vera's husband. You are qualified and obligated to help her manage the northern frontier." Okay. Colin was secretly relieved. In fact, he did not want to be restrained by Marquis Garcia. Fortunately, the other party did not have such an intention. Then Colin said, "In addition, I will go to the half-elf kingdom to purchase food next month. I hope that you can help me in the northern frontier." Marquis Garcia turned his head with a mischievous smile on his face. Queen Aisha is about to give birth, right? After his real purpose was seen through, Colin smiled awkwardly and nodded. Marquis Garcia did not say anything. After all, he had an illegitimate daughter. Therefore, he did not blame Colin on this issue. Be careful on the road. Marquis Garcia nodded casually and walked out of the study. Yes. Chapter 348. Colin pushed open the mahogany door that separated the bedroom from the living room and saw a beautiful figure sitting in front of the dressing table. Her blonde hair was tied up in a loose and casual style, and the silver mirror on the dressing table reflected her delicate face. Coupled with the purple silk nightgown, it highlighted a hazy and lazy charm, making people yearn for the moment when she turned around. Are you done chatting? Vera turned around with a charming and sweet smile on her face, and her blue crystal eyes were full of tenderness. For a moment, the whole bedroom seemed to be lit up. Yes. Colin walked in while unbuttoning the collar of his suit. Every time I chat with the Marquis, I benefit a lot. What were you talking about? About loyalty and belief. Vera tilted her head and the smile on her face disappeared. When Colin saw this, he thought that she had misunderstood. So he explained, "It's not what you think. The Marquis is just sharing his own beliefs and his understanding of loyalty with me. He hopes that I can be inspired and find my own beliefs." Vera's expression eased a little, but she still looked at Colin seriously and said, "In fact, I have always felt that my father's life is too tiring." Colin took off his coat and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his wife's shining eyes and said with a smile, "So, you don't agree with Marquis Garcia's lifelong beliefs?" Vera shook her head and frowned slightly before she said, "My father carries too much on his shoulders, and so does my adoptive father. I know that they are very good people, and in a sense, they can even be called great people, but I don't want you to become like them." Looking at Vera's gentle eyes, Colin's heart was filled with warmth, and he smiled from the bottom of his heart. "Don't worry, I will not become like them. I have my own principles, and I also have my own cherished things, and these are everything that is worth protecting." To be honest, although Colin admired Marquis Garcia's dedication, he did not think that he could be as noble as him. Moreover, he also felt that both Marquis Garcia and the former Duke of St. Hilda were too extreme. He hoped that he would be able to live freely in this life, and not be influenced by any power or noble goals. Of course, it might seem easy to achieve this, but it was actually extremely difficult. Without sufficient strength, with Colin's current status and power, it would be impossible for him to live a peaceful life. Therefore, in order to achieve this goal, Colin had to control more forces and obtain more power. Vera smiled sweetly, got up gracefully, and walked towards Colin with graceful steps. The slit on both sides of her nightgown revealed a pair of flawless legs, slender and straight, white and tender. She walked in front of Colin and held his shoulder. She bent her right leg and knelt on the edge of the bed. She bent her beautiful neck and bent her beautiful face. There was a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, and her eyes were shining with passion. "Then, am I also someone who is worthy of your protection?" "As my wife, of course you are," Colin said affirmatively as he held Vera's slender waist and felt the warmth and softness in his hands. Vera's eyes became misty and she licked her delicate red lips gently. Her charming appearance made Colin's heart burn with passion. He exerted a little force and pulled the girl onto the big bed. The soft morning sun shone through the crystal skylight at the top of the knight's hall and formed a pure beam of light. The colorful glass reflected the mottled light and shadows. The statues of the 14 paladins of the House of St. Hilda stood on both sides of the hall, as if they were looking at the figures in the hall through the barrier of time. Colin was wearing the Viscount's suit as he walked into the beam of light. He knelt down on one knee in front of the steps and at the same time, raised the blade of judgment high above his head. In front of him, Vera, who was also dressed up, took the blade of judgment with a solemn expression on her face. She then placed the blade of judgment on Colin's shoulder, and said in a clear voice, "I, Vera St. Hilda, in the name of the Dukes of the North, confer on Colin Angelo the title of Count of the Empire of Light. From today onwards, the Angeli family will be the hereditary Count of the Empire of Light." Colin clasped his left hand in front of his chest as he raised his head and looked into his wife's bright eyes. "I, Colin Angelo, am willing to devote my loyalty to the respected dukes of the north. I will protect my people with my life, and repay the house of St. Hilda with my glory. I will not let you down. Vera then handed the sword back to Colin before she took out the count's seal and suit from the servant beside her, and gave them to Colin. At this point, the Angeli family's count-conferring ceremony was officially over. The hall was immediately filled with enthusiastic cheers and applause. Although the nobles who came to watch the ceremony were inevitably jealous of this young count of the empire, no one dared to be unconvinced. Not to mention that Colin was the husband of the Dukes of the North and the guardian of the northern frontier. Just based on his outstanding military achievements in the Northern Frontier Rebellion, he was worthy of the title of Count. No one could deny that in the short span of 2 years, this once obscure baron's son had leaped to become one of the most important figures in the northern region, and even in the empire. Archbishop Akani, who was wearing a white priest's robe, came in front of Colin and drew a holy emblem on her chest. She then revealed a pure and kind smile and said, "May the supreme God of light guide you on your path. Praise the God of light." The two of them looked at each other, and perhaps only the two of them could understand the deep meaning in their eyes. After that, the nobles who came to watch the ceremony came forward to congratulate the new count. When it was Knight Cambenin's turn, Colin suddenly asked in a low voice, "Knight Cambenin, the Duke has appointed Knight Fermi as the new commander of the Golden Lion Legion. You should know about this, right?" Cambenin lowered his head and said in a muffled voice, "Yes, the Duke has mentioned this to me before." "Then you should also understand that this is not the Duke's intention." "I understand. This is the will of the royal family. The Duke does not need to feel embarrassed." "I can understand." "No." Colin reached out and pressed on Knight Cambenin's shoulder as he said in a deep voice, "You are the one that the Duke and I truly trust. Although Knight Fermi is going to be the commander of the Golden Lion Legion, it does not mean that the Duke is relieved to hand over this important army to him." Cambenin's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked up at Colin and asked respectfully, "My lord, what would you like me to do?" Colin smiled faintly. Taking advantage of this opportunity to appoint a new legion commander, his lordship is preparing to make a big adjustment to the officers of the Golden Lion Legion. As for how to make this adjustment, I hope you can give his lordship some suggestions. Cambenin's heart skipped a beat as he immediately understood Colin's meaning. This was clearly an opportunity for him to place his own trusted aides in the Golden Lion Legion. This way, even if Knight Fermi became the commander of the Golden Lion Legion, he would only be a commander without an army. As long as all the middle and lower-ranking officers were Knight Cambenin's men, he would be the true commander of the Golden Lion Legion. After understanding this, the haze on Cambenin's face immediately disappeared. He excitedly lowered his voice and said, "Thank you, my lord, for your trust. I will draft a list for you." Colin smiled in relief and patted Knight Cambenin's shoulder again. Knight Cambenin bowed respectfully and retreated. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.